I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment and justice, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. The white roses were perfect. I had arranged them myself that morning, cutting stems from the garden Charles and I had cultivated together over for decades. Each bloom was positioned precisely in the Waterford crystal vase, a wedding gift from his parents that had graced our dining room table for countless celebrations. The candlelight flickered against the bone china, casting dancing shadows across the mahogany table where we'd shared 40 years of meals, conversations, and dreams. Julia, Charles's voice cut through my thoughts as I adjusted the final rose. We need to talk. I turned to face my husband of 40 years, noting how distinguished he looked in his navy blazer, the one I'd helped him select for our anniversary dinner. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his jaw cleanly shaven, and his blue eyes held that familiar confidence that had first attracted me at a charity gala in 1983. But something was different tonight. There was a coldness in his gaze that made my stomach tighten. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Of course, darling. Shall we sit? I gestured to the table where I'd set out his favorite scotch alongside the champagne I'd been chilling since noon. I thought we could toast before I want a divorce. The words hit me like ice water. I stood frozen, my hand still extended toward the champagne bottle, my mind struggling to process what he'd just said. 40 years of marriage. And this was how he chose to mark our anniversary. I'm sorry, what did you say? My voice remained steady, a lifetime of hosting dinner parties and charity events having trained me to maintain composure even when the world tilted sideways. Charles walked to the bar cart, pouring himself 3 fingers of Macallan without offering me anything. I said I want a divorce, Julia. I've been thinking about this for months, and I've made my decision. I'm filing papers next week. I sank into my chair, the silk of my anniversary dress, the deep blue one he'd once said, brought out my eyes, suddenly feeling suffocating. But Charles, I don't understand. We've been happy, haven't we? We just booked that trip to Tuscany for the fall, and you seemed excited about I've met someone, he interrupted, swirling his scotch as casually as if he were discussing the weather. Her name is Lana. She makes me feel alive again, Julia. Young, like I have a future instead of just a past. The room spun slightly. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white against the dark wood. Someone? You're having an affair? It's not an affair. It's love. Charles's voice took on a dreamy quality I hadn't heard in years. She's vibrant, full of life. She's 28, Julia. 28 and brilliant and beautiful. And she sees something in me that I'd forgotten existed. 28. I did the math automatically. She was younger than our nephew David. Younger than the children we'd never had, because Charles had always said his career needed to come first. And then later, when the doctors had delivered their gentle disappointments, he'd said perhaps it was for the best. We had each other, he'd said. Then, we had our life together. Where did you meet her? I heard myself ask, as if this detail mattered, as if understanding the geography of my betrayal would somehow make it comprehensible. At the club. She was planning the Henderson wedding. She's an event coordinator. She's transitioning into interior design now. He smiled, actually smiled, as if this conversation was pleasant for him. She has such vision, such creativity. She's helped me see that life doesn't have to be about looking backward all the time. I thought of all the events I'd planned at the country club, all the committees I'd chaired, all the ways I'd supported his business relationships and social connections over the years. Had I been looking backward? I'd thought I was building something lasting, something meaningful. How long? I asked quietly. 6 months. The casualness of his answer was devastating. 6 months of deception, of coming home to me each night while his heart was elsewhere. 6 months of lies disguised as normalcy. And you've decided this without discussing it with me? Without counseling, without trying to work through whatever's wrong? Charles set down his glass and looked at me with what might have been pity. Julia, nothing's wrong exactly. We've just grown apart. We want different things now. I want to feel passion again, excitement. I want to wake up eager for the day instead of just going through motions. His words stung because there was truth in them. When had we stopped talking about dreams and started only discussing schedules? When had passion faded into companionship, and companionship into mere habit? What about our life here? Our home? Our friends? Everything we've built together? That's what I want to talk about. Charles's tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. I'll be fair, of course. The house, the boat, most of the assets. Honestly, Julia, you won't want the hassle of managing all that anyway. I'll handle the financial details so you don't have to worry about any of it. Something in his phrasing triggered an alarm in my mind. You won't want the hassle. As if he'd already decided what I would and wouldn't want, what I was and wasn't capable of handling. I see. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than I'd expected. And when does this transition begin? I've already moved some things to the guest cottage at the club, just temporarily, to give us both space to process this. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Lana thinks we think it's better if we don't drag this out. Clean breaks are healthier for everyone, Lana thinks. This stranger, this child, was already making decisions about my life. I walked to the window overlooking our garden, the same garden where we'd hosted countless parties, where Charles had once told me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, where we'd talked about growing old together under the oak tree we'd planted our first year in this house. I suppose dinner is off then. I turned back to face him, proud that my voice remained level. Charles had the decency to wince. I'm sorry, Julia. I know the timing is terrible, but I couldn't keep pretending. You deserve honesty. Honesty. After 6 months of deception, he wanted credit for honesty. Yes, well, I appreciate that. I walked to the table and began blowing out the candles, one by one. The smell of extinguished wicks filled the air. I assume you'll want to collect more of your things soon? I'll call first, of course. And Julia? He paused at the doorway. I hope you understand that this isn't about you not being enough. It's about me needing something different. After he left, I sat alone at our anniversary table, surrounded by roses that would wilt, champagne that would go flat, and the remnants of a life I'd thought was unshakable. I didn't cry, not yet. Instead, I found myself thinking about Charles's words, particularly his assumption that I wouldn't want the hassle of managing our assets. In 40 years of marriage, I'd let Charles handle most of our finances. He was the investment professional after all. But I wasn't naive about money. My father had been a successful architect, my mother a savvy real estate investor. I'd grown up understanding the value of property, art, and careful financial planning. I'd simply chosen to trust my husband's expertise. But trust, I was learning, could be a dangerous luxury. I walked to Charles's study and turned on his computer. The password was still our wedding date. Apparently his sentimental attachment to our marriage hadn't extended to his digital security. I began methodically reviewing our accounts, something I hadn't done in years. What I found made my blood run cold. Transfers I didn't recognize, appraisals of jewelry I'd inherited from my grandmother, missing documentation for artwork we'd purchased together. Charles hadn't just been planning to leave me, he'd been systematically preparing to take everything of value with him. I printed everything, my hands surprisingly steady as I organized the evidence of his financial deceptions. Tomorrow, I would start making calls, but tonight, I would finish what was left of the champagne and begin planning my own clean break. After all, as Charles had so eloquently put it, I deserved honesty. And the honest truth was that he had vastly underestimated the woman he'd chosen to betray. The morning sun streaming through the kitchen windows felt different, somehow sharper, less forgiving. I sat at the breakfast bar with my coffee and laptop, surrounded by the printed financial documents from the previous evening. Each page told a story of calculated deception that made my chest tight with anger and, surprisingly, a growing sense of clarity. Charles had left early to play golf, he'd said, though I suspected he was really going to see Lana. The house felt hollow without him, but also somehow lighter, as if his presence had been a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. My phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Isabel Chen's name appeared on the screen, and I felt a rush of relief. Izzy was more than just my goddaughter, she was the daughter of my heart, my best friend Margaret's girl, who'd grown into a formidable family law attorney with one of San Francisco's most prestigious firms. Aunt Julia? Her voice carried immediate concern. I was thinking about you and Uncle Charles this morning. How was your anniversary dinner? I'd planned to ease into the conversation, to find a graceful way to share the news, but the kindness in her voice broke something inside me. He asked for a divorce, sweetheart. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. Then, I'm coming over. Don't do anything. Don't sign anything. Don't even talk to him until I get there. 90 minutes later, Izzy sat across from me at my kitchen island, her dark hair pulled back in a severe chignon that emphasized the fierce intelligence in her eyes. She was 34, brilliant, and had inherited her mother's protective instincts along with her father's analytical mind. Tell me everything, she said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a yellow legal pad. Start from the beginning and don't leave out anything, no matter how small or embarrassing it might seem. I walked her through the previous evening, from the roses to Charles's casual announcement, to his assumption that I wouldn't want the hassle of managing our assets. Izzy's expression grew darker with each detail. And you found financial irregularities? She asked, reviewing the documents I'd printed. More than irregularities. Look at this. I pointed to a series of transfers from our joint savings account. $50,000 moved to an account I've never seen before. And here I flipped to another page. A professional appraisal of my grandmother's jewelry collection, dated 3 weeks ago. I never authorized that. Izzy studied the papers with the focused intensity that had made her one of the youngest partners in her firm's history. Julia, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do you have your prenuptial agreement? I nodded, retrieving the folder from Charles's study. I'd signed it 40 years ago without really reading it. I'd been so in love, so trusting, so certain that our marriage would last forever that the legal formalities had seemed irrelevant. Izzy read through the document, making notes and occasionally asking questions about specific assets or properties. After 20 minutes, she looked up with an expression I couldn't quite read. Julia, do you remember your grandmother's house in Presidio Heights? Of course. We sold it when she died in 1995. The Victorian had been my childhood sanctuary, full of my grandmother's art collection and antique furniture. Actually, you didn't sell it. According to this prenup and the property records I pulled this morning, your grandmother left the house to you in a trust. The sale proceeds, all 2.8 million of them went into an investment account that's been growing for 28 years. It's now worth approximately $8.2 million. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers, shattering on the marble floor. That's impossible. Charles handles our investments. He would have told me Charles has been managing the account, yes, but legally, it belongs entirely to you, along with your grandmother's art collection, which is valued at another 1.6 million, and several other assets your parents left you. Izzy's voice was gentle but firm. Julia, you're not just financially comfortable, you're independently wealthy. You have been for decades. The kitchen seemed to spin around me. All these years, I'd felt dependent on Charles's financial expertise, grateful for his provision and care. I'd made myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating because I'd believed I needed his protection. He knows this, I said slowly, understanding dawning like cold sunrise. The appraisals, the account transfers, he's been positioning himself to claim assets that aren't legally his. That's exactly what he's been doing. And Julia? Izzy leaned forward, her expression fierce. What he's done is potentially criminal. Fraud. Especially if he's been accessing your trust accounts without authorization. Before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see a familiar figure on the porch, Marta Rodriguez, who'd been our housekeeper for 25 years. She came twice a week usually, but today wasn't one of her regular days. Mrs. Julia, Marta said when I opened the door, her usually cheerful demeanor subdued. I need to speak with you. It's important. I invited her into the kitchen where she greeted Izzy warmly. She'd watched Izzy grow up during family gatherings and holidays. Mrs. Julia, I don't like to interfere, but Marta glanced nervously toward the door. Mr. Charles, he's been acting strange these past months. Yesterday, when you were at the market, he brought a young woman here. She was going through your jewelry box, taking pictures of everything. My hand instinctively went to my throat, where I usually wore the pearl necklace that had been my mother's. And last week, Marta continued, he had men come to look at the paintings in the living room. They were writing things down, measuring. When I asked what they were doing, he said you were thinking of redecorating, but she shrugged apologetically. You love those paintings, Mrs. Julia. You would never get rid of them. Izzy and I exchanged glances. The paintings Marta referred to were part of my grandmother's collection, a small Monet, 2 Picasso drawings, and several California clean air works that had been in my family for generations. Marta, this is very important, Izzy said gently. Do you remember what the men looked like? What company they might have been from? I took a picture, Marta said, pulling out her phone. Something felt wrong, so I took a picture of their truck when they were leaving. The image showed a white van with Bay Area Fine Arts Appraisal Services printed on the side, along with a phone number. Izzy immediately began typing on her phone. Within minutes, she'd confirmed that Bay Area Fine Arts was a legitimate appraisal company that specialized in insurance evaluations and estate sales. He's been systematically cataloging everything of value, I said, the full scope of Charles's deception becoming clear. The jewelry, the art, probably the antiques too. He's preparing to claim them in the divorce, or sell them before you can stop him, Izzy added grimly. Julia, we need to move fast. I'm filing an emergency injunction today to freeze all assets and prevent any sales or transfers. And I think you should consider moving your most valuable items to secure storage immediately. Over the next 3 hours, Marta and I carefully photographed and packed my grandmother's jewelry collection, the most valuable paintings, and several important documents. Izzy arranged for a secure storage facility and accompanied us to make sure everything was properly documented and insured. As we drove back from the storage facility, Izzy glanced at me with concern. How are you holding up? I know this is overwhelming. I considered the question carefully. 12 hours ago, I'd thought I was a woman whose husband had simply fallen out of love with her. Now I knew I was a woman whose husband had been systematically planning to defraud her while pursuing another relationship. I'm angry, I said finally, but I'm also something else. I feel awakened. For 40 years, I've let Charles handle everything because I trusted him, and because it seemed like the natural division of labor. But I'm not helpless, Izzy. I'm not the decorative wife he apparently thinks I am. No, you're definitely not. Izzy pulled into my driveway and turned to face me. Julia, I want you to know that legally, you're in an incredibly strong position. The prenup he probably forgot you have actually protects you, not him. Most of your significant assets are separate property, and his attempt to liquidate them could constitute criminal fraud. As I walked into my empty house, Charles was still playing golf. I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the thrill of possibility. Not just the possibility of surviving this betrayal, but of discovering who I might become on the other side of it. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and opened my laptop again. But instead of looking at financial statements, I found myself researching something Charles had mentioned months ago: a vintage car auction coming up in Pebble Beach. He'd been obsessing over a particular lot, a 1961 Jaguar E-Type that he called the holy grail of British sports cars. Charles had always been passionate about vintage automobiles, but his enthusiasm had intensified recently. He spent hours on collector websites, attended auctions as an observer, and had been waiting for the right opportunity to make a serious purchase. I stared at the auction listing, studying the sleek lines of the Jaguar in the photograph. Estimated sale price, $1.2 to $1.8 million. A fortune, certainly, but not out of reach for someone with the resources I'd apparently possessed all along. An idea began to form in my mind, not cruel or vengeful, but precise and poetic. Charles thought he knew me, thought he could predict my reactions and responses. He'd planned his deception around his assumption that I was weak, dependent, and fundamentally passive. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Saturday morning found me driving through the rolling hills of Sonoma County, the autumn sunlight filtering through golden leaves as I made my way to Vega Classics, a restoration shop I'd found through careful online research. Charles had mentioned the place before. It was where serious collectors went for authentic restoration work on European sports cars. I'd called ahead, explaining that I was interested in learning more about vintage automobiles as a potential new hobby. The receptionist had been friendly and accommodating, scheduling me for a consultation with Anthony Vega himself. The shop occupied a converted warehouse set back from the main road, surrounded by immaculate gardens and several gleaming vintage cars displayed like sculptures. As I parked my BMW, I caught sight of a stunning red Ferrari being worked on through an open bay door, its engine exposed like a jeweled heart. Mrs. Harrington? A man emerged from the shop, wiping his hands on a clean shop towel. He was perhaps 50, with salt and pepper hair, intelligent dark eyes, and the kind of genuine smile that seemed to come from someone comfortable in his own skin. I'm Anthony Vega. Thank you for coming out to see us. Please, call me Julia. And thank you for taking the time to meet with me. I shook his hand, noting the strength in his grip and the slight calluses that spoke of someone who worked with his hands as well as his mind. My pleasure. I have to say, it's refreshing to meet someone who's genuinely curious about the craft rather than just the status symbol. Come on, let me show you around. Anthony led me through the shop, explaining the restoration process with obvious passion. He showed me cars in various stages of completion: a 1950 seconds Aston Martin having its engine rebuilt, a Porsche 356 being rewired, a Jaguar X receiving new paint in a color he called British Racing Green. Each car tells a story, he said, running his hand along the Jaguar's fender with obvious affection. This one belonged to a doctor in Sacramento who bought it new in 1964. He drove it every weekend for 30 years, then parked it in his garage when he retired. His daughter brought it to us after he passed. Said he always talked about having it properly restored but never got around to it. It's beautiful, I said, genuinely moved by both the car and Anthony's obvious respect for its history. Do you work on many Jaguars? Oh yes. They're some of my favorite cars to restore. British engineering at its finest when they're running properly. There's nothing quite like them. He grinned. Of course, keeping them running properly is its own challenge. I laughed, surprising myself with how natural it felt. I imagine that's part of the appeal for enthusiasts. Exactly. Though some enthusiasts are more realistic about the commitment than others, Anthony's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. You know, speaking of Jaguars, you wouldn't happen to be related to Charles Harrington, would you? The resemblance is quite striking. My stomach tightened, but I kept my voice level. He's my husband. You know Charles? We've met a few times at various events. He's very passionate about a particular E-type that's coming up for auction. Anthony's diplomatic phrasing told me there was more to the story. The one in Pebble Beach? He's mentioned it several times. I decided to venture into deeper waters. From what I understand, it's quite special. Anthony's eyes lit up with professional enthusiasm. It's extraordinary. A 1961 Series IE type, one of only 12 made in that specific configuration. Fixed head coupe, matching numbers, documented provenance from new. It's been owned by the same family for over 40 years, meticulously maintained, never damaged or modified. He pulled out his phone and showed me several photographs of the car, a stunning coupe in deep blue with a tan leather interior that looked absolutely pristine. Charles has been following this car for years, Anthony continued. The family has turned down several private offers, but they're finally ready to sell at auction. It's what we call a holy grail car in the collector world. What makes it so special beyond the rarity? Everything. The color combination is perfect. The interior is completely original, and the mechanical restoration was done by the factory-trained technicians at Jaguar North America about 10 years ago. Plus, it has racing history. The original owner campaigned it at Laguna Seca in the mid-60s. Anthony's passion was infectious. A car like this at auction could easily bring 1.5 to 1.8 million. I felt a small thrill at the confirmation of my research. That's quite an investment. Is, and honestly, between you and me, I've always wondered if Charles fully understands what he's getting into. Anthony paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. I mean no disrespect, but serious collecting requires more than just passion. It requires significant capital reserves, proper storage, ongoing maintenance costs, insurance. It's not something you go into lightly. You don't think he's prepared? Anthony shifted uncomfortably. Let's just say that in my experience, the collectors who are truly ready for a purchase of this magnitude don't usually spend 3 years talking about it without acting, and they don't typically try to negotiate payment terms for an auction purchase. My interest sharpened. Payment terms? He approached the auction house about arranging financing, using other assets as collateral. It's not unheard of, but, Anthony shrugged. Cars like this usually go to buyers who can write a check on the spot. I absorbed this information, understanding now that Charles's urgency about liquidating our assets was partly driven by his desire to fund this purchase. He needed cash, and he'd decided that my inheritance would provide it. You seem to know quite a lot about the car, I observed. Have you worked on it? I did some consultation work when they were deciding on the restoration approach about 12 years ago. Spent several days with it, really got to know its personality. Anthony's expression grew wistful. It's a remarkable machine. Whoever ends up with it will be getting something truly special. As we walked back toward the shop's entrance, I found myself genuinely enjoying Anthony's company. He was knowledgeable without being condescending, passionate without being obsessive, and he treated me like an intelligent adult rather than a decorative accessory. Anthony, can I ask you something? We'd stopped beside a beautifully restored Porsche Speedster. If someone wanted to learn more about the auction process, hypothetically, how would they go about it? For the Pebble Beach auction? Well, first you'd need to register as a qualified bidder. That requires financial verification, proof of funds, bank references, that sort of thing. The auction house wants to make sure serious bidders can actually complete their purchases. He studied my face with curiosity. Are you thinking about attending? Just curious. Charles talks about it so much. I thought it might be interesting to understand the process. Anthony nodded. Blackstone Auctions handles the Pebble Beach event. Elliot Grant is their director, very professional, very discreet. If you're seriously interested in learning more, I could introduce you. He's always happy to educate potential new collectors. That's very kind of you. I pulled out my business card, one I'd had made years ago for my volunteer work with various arts organizations. Would you mind if I took some time to think about it? This is all quite new to me. Anthony studied my card with interest. Julia Harrington, arts consultant and philanthropic advisor. He looked up with renewed respect. I should have realized. You're the Julia Harrington who organized the California Modern Exhibition at SFOMA? I was surprised he knew about my work. The exhibition had been one of my prouder achievements, 2 years of research and coordination to bring together a comprehensive show of mid-century California artists. You know about that? My ex-wife is a museum curator. She raved about that show for months, said it was one of the best organized exhibitions she'd ever seen. Anthony's smile was warm and genuine. I have to say, it makes much more sense now. Why you're interested in vintage cars? There are objects as much as they are machines. As I drove home through the wine country, I found myself thinking about more than just Charles's automotive obsession. Anthony Vega was clearly a man who appreciated craftsmanship, authenticity, and the stories behind beautiful objects. In 40 years of marriage, Charles had never once asked about my work with the arts community or shown genuine interest in my expertise. But more importantly, I now understood exactly what Charles was planning. The Jaguar represented everything. He valued status, exclusivity, and the admiration of other men who shared his obsessions. He'd been planning to use my inheritance to buy his dream car, probably presenting it as a joint marital asset while claiming sole ownership. The irony was exquisite. Charles had spent months appraising and cataloging my possessions, preparing to claim them as his own, but he'd overlooked the most important asset of all, my own intelligence and capability. That evening, I called the number Anthony had given me for Blackstone Auctions. Elliot Grant's assistant scheduled an appointment for Monday morning to discuss their services and the qualification process for bidders. After I hung up, I sat in Charles's study and opened the jewelry box where I kept my engagement ring. The 5-carat diamond caught the lamplight, throwing tiny rainbows across the wall. Charles had been so proud when he'd proposed with it, telling everyone who would listen about its quality and value. I slipped the ring off my finger for the first time in 40 years and held it up to the light. Tomorrow, I would have it appraised. Not because I planned to sell it immediately, but because I wanted to understand all my options. Charles had taught me an important lesson about the value of preparation. It was time to put that lesson to use. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of Julia's private sitting room, casting delicate shadows across the mahogany secretary desk where her grandmother's jewelry box sat open. Inside, nestled in midnight blue velvet, lay the engagement ring that had once symbolized forever, a flawless 3-carat emerald-cut diamond surrounded by vintage platinum filigree, circa 1925. Charles had presented it with such ceremony 40 years ago, his younger self trembling slightly as he dropped to one knee in her parents' rose garden. Now, as Julia lifted the ring with steady fingers, she felt nothing but clarity. The weight that had pressed against her finger for 4 decades seemed insignificant compared to the weight of betrayal she'd been carrying since that anniversary dinner 3 weeks prior. Mrs. Harrington? Marta's voice drifted softly from the doorway. The housekeeper held a silver tray bearing chamomile tea and fresh croissants from the French bakery downtown. You requested breakfast at 8:30. Thank you, Marta. Julia slipped the ring into a small velvet pouch. And please, you've known me long enough, it's Julia. Marta's weathered face softened with something that might have been relief. After 25 years in the Harrington household, she'd witnessed the subtle erosion of warmth that had preceded Charles's announcement. The housekeeper had been the first to notice the late-night phone calls, the mysterious absences, the way Charles no longer looked at his wife during their morning coffee ritual. The car will be here in an hour, Julia continued, accepting the delicate china cup. I should be back by 3. Mr. Harrington mentioned he'd be at the club until evening. The young lady called again, Marta said quietly, her disapproval evident in the careful modulation of her voice. Miss Mendez. She wanted to know about the dinner service, which pieces you'd be taking. Julia's teacup paused halfway to her lips. Taking where? She seemed to think, well, that you'd be moving out soon. The presumption was breathtaking, even for Lana. Julia had learned from Izzy that the 28-year-old former event coordinator had already begun treating the Harrington house as her future domain, making inquiries about staff schedules and entertaining spaces. The audacity might have been amusing if it weren't so calculatedly predatory. I see. Julia's voice remained perfectly level. What did you tell her? That household decisions remain with you, Mrs. Julia, as they always have. Good. Julia rose, smoothing the lines of her charcoal wool dress. Marta, I want you to know that regardless of what happens with the divorce, your position here is secure. You've been family to me far longer than. She stopped herself. Some thoughts were better left unspoken, even to allies. Marta's eyes misted slightly. 40 years I've watched you make this house a home. That girl thinks she can waltz in and claim what you built. She doesn't understand what real elegance looks like. Julia squeezed the older woman's hand. Keep your eyes open while I'm gone today. Note anyone who visits, any calls that come through. The house line. Charles may be planning moves we haven't anticipated yet. An hour later, Julia's Bentley pulled up to the discreet brownstone that housed Whitmore and Associates, the most prestigious jewelry appraisers in Northern California. She'd made the appointment under her maiden name, Julia Westbrook, explaining only that she needed a contemporary market valuation for an estate piece. Richard Whitmore himself greeted her in his private viewing room, a space designed to showcase precious stones under optimal lighting conditions. At 72, he'd appraised jewelry for tech billionaires, Hollywood royalty, and old San Francisco families for nearly 5 decades. Mrs. Westbrook, he said, gesturing to a velvet-lined chair across from his examination table. I understand you have a significant piece for evaluation. Julia withdrew the ring from its pouch, placing it gently on the black velvet display pad. Under the specialized lighting, the diamonds seemed to capture and refract every photon, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the room's cream walls. Whitmore's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication that he was impressed. He studied the ring through a series of magnifying glasses, making notes on official letterhead with the methodical precision of a surgeon. Exceptional, he murmured after several minutes. The clarity is flawless, truly flawless, not simply the commercial grade. The cut is vintage Edwardian, likely by Marcus and Company. The platinum setting shows their signature mill grain work. He looked up at Julia. May I ask the provenance? It was purchased in 1984 from Shreve and Company in San Francisco. I have the original documentation. Yes, I can see why. This stone likely came from the old Golconda mines in India, the same source as the Hope diamond. The fire and brilliance are unmistakable. Whitmore returned to his examination, photographing the ring from multiple angles. Mrs. Westbrook, are you considering sale or insurance purposes? Julia had rehearsed this moment in her mind dozens of times. Sale. I need to move quickly, within the week if possible. Whitmore nodded without judgment. He'd worked with enough wealthy clients to understand that life circumstances could shift rapidly, necessitating the liquidation of even treasured pieces. I can arrange a private sale through our network of collectors. Given the quality and provenance, I'd estimate the value at 1.2 to 1.4 million. The number hit Julia with unexpected force. She'd known the ring was valuable, but hearing the amount aloud transformed it from sentimental object to powerful financial instrument. $1.2 million. Enough to change everything. How quickly? She asked. I have 3 clients who collect vintage engagement rings. Specifically, 2 are in the Bay Area, 1 in Los Angeles. If you're comfortable with the authentication process, I could have offers by tomorrow afternoon. Julia felt something shift inside her chest, not heartbreak, but rather the crystallization of purpose. Please proceed with the evaluation. I'll want certified appraisal documentation regardless. Of course, the full report will be ready by close of business today. As Julia left the appraisal office, she drove not toward home but to the financial district, where Izzy maintained her law office in one of the gleaming towers overlooking the bay. Her goddaughter had texted that morning, "Emergency meeting at PM, bring your game face." Izzy's corner office reflected her personality, sophisticated but approachable, with contemporary art mixing easily with family photographs and legal awards. At 34, Isabella Chen had built a reputation as one of the city's most formidable family law attorneys, handling divorces for tech executives, entertainment industry figures, and old money families who valued discretion above headlines. "You look different," Izzy said the moment Julia entered. "Lighter somehow. I sold my engagement ring this morning. Or rather, I initiated the process." Izzy's dark eyes widened. "Jesus, Julia, are you sure? That's $1.2 million. Julia settled into the leather chair across from Izzy's desk. "Give or take. Holy shit," Izzy caught herself. "Sorry, professional habit. But seriously, that's serious money. What's your plan?" Julia withdrew a printed email from her purse. "I want to show you something I discovered last night." The email was from Barrett Auctions International, one of the most exclusive vintage automobile auction houses in the world. Julia had found it in Charles's deleted items folder when she'd accessed his computer using the password he'd never changed there. Wedding date, followed by his birth year. Lot 47, Izzy read aloud. 1961 Jaguar E-Type Series 1 Roadster. Provence blue with tan leather interior. Matching numbers engine and transmission. Complete restoration by Mark specialists. Estimated value, $800,000 to $1.2 million. Charles has been obsessing over that car for 3 years, Julia explained. He bid on it at a private auction in Carmel 2 years ago but was outbid by someone from Switzerland. The car is coming up for public auction next month at the Monterey Classic Car Week. Izzy leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. "You want to buy his dream car?" "I want to buy it anonymously, yes." And then, Julia paused, choosing her words carefully. "And then I want to reveal my ownership at the most strategic moment possible." That's brilliant. And beautifully twisted. Izzy pulled up a calendar on her computer. "The Monterey auction is August 15th. If we can expedite the ring sale, you'll have the funds with time to spare. But Julia, you'll need to be careful about the paper trail. Charles still has access to some of your financial accounts. I've been thinking about that. What if we set up a trust? Something that maintains anonymity until I choose otherwise." "Absolutely. We can create a revocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary. I'll handle the paperwork through a third-party legal entity, completely legitimate and completely private." Izzy made notes on her legal pad. "But there's something else you need to know. I had lunch with my contact at the DA's office yesterday." Julia felt her stomach tighten. "About Charles?" "About the asset liquidation we discovered. Julia, what he's doing, the secret appraisals, the attempts to sell community property without your knowledge, it's not just unethical, it's potentially criminal. Fraudulent transfer of assets during marriage dissolution proceedings is a felony in California. Are you suggesting I should press charges?" "I'm suggesting you should be aware of all your options." "But honestly, what you're planning with the car, it's more elegant than criminal prosecution. It's going to accomplish what the legal system never could. Complete psychological checkmate." Julia's phone buzzed with a text message. "Richard Whitmore. Offers received. Please call at your earliest convenience." "That's my appraiser," Julia said. "It looks like the ring already has buyers." An hour later, Julia sat in her car outside Whitmore's office, staring at the sales contract in her hands. Mrs. Eleanor Drummond, widow of a tech industry pioneer, had offered $1.35 million for the ring sight unseen, based solely on Whitmore's reputation and photographs. The sale could be completed within 48 hours. Julia thought of Charles, probably at the country club at that very moment, charming Lana over expensive wine while calculating how to divide assets. He assumed Julia would surrender without a fight. He'd always underestimated her, treating her intelligence as decorative, her contributions as supportive rather than substantial. Even during their marriage's early years, when she'd been building her interior design practice, Charles had introduced her to his colleagues as "my wife Julia, who has a little decorating business." That dismissiveness had become so habitual that Charles genuinely seemed to believe Julia was incapable of strategic thinking. He'd forgotten that she'd been the one to identify the undervalued real estate investments that had tripled their net worth in the 90s. He'd forgotten that her little decorating business had connected them to the network of wealthy collectors who'd become their social circle. Most importantly, he'd forgotten that she'd spent 4 decades quietly observing his weaknesses, his obsessions, and his fears. As Julia signed the sales contract with a Mont Blanc pen that had been her grandmother's, she felt the weight of 40 years lifting from her shoulders. She wasn't destroying Charles, she was simply ensuring that his carefully constructed fantasy would collapse under the weight of its own arrogance. The ring would be gone by Friday. The trust would be established by the following Monday. And Charles's beloved Jaguar, the car he'd described to anyone who would listen as the holy grail of British automotive design, would belong to his discarded wife before the month ended. Julia's phone rang as she prepared to leave the appraiser's office. Charles's name appeared on the screen. "Hello, darling," she answered, her voice carrying the same warm tone she'd cultivated for decades. "Julia, I'm glad I caught you. Lana and I were hoping to swing by the house this evening to discuss some of the transition details. Nothing formal, just getting a sense of timelines." The casual presumption was breathtaking. Charles was bringing his girlfriend to their marital home to discuss how quickly Julia could be removed from the equation. It was exactly the sort of thoughtless cruelty that had defined the past month. "Of course," Julia replied. "I'll have Marta prepare something light. 6:30? Perfect. And Julia, I hope we can keep this friendly. For both our sakes." "Naturally, Charles. I've never been anything but civilized." As Julia ended the call, she wondered if Charles would still consider her civilized when he realized what was coming. She suspected not, but by then, it wouldn't matter what Charles thought about anything. That evening, Julia prepared for Charles and Lana's visit with the same meticulous attention she'd once brought to hosting dinner parties for his business associates. She chose a simple black dress, elegant but not flashy, and her grandmother's pearl necklace. Nothing that suggested she was struggling financially or emotionally. Marta had prepared an antipasti spread with wine from Charles's collection, a subtle reminder of exactly whose taste had built the cellar he was so proud of. Julia had also arranged for fresh flowers throughout the main rooms, creating an atmosphere of serene domesticity that would underscore the stability Charles was choosing to abandon. At precisely 6:30, Charles's Porsche pulled into the circular drive. Julia watched from the living room window as he opened the passenger door for Lana, who emerged wearing a white sundress that was clearly expensive but somehow managed to look cheap. The young woman carried herself with the studied casualness of someone who'd never learned that true confidence doesn't require performance. Julia opened the front door before they could ring the bell, greeting them with the same gracious smile she'd perfected over decades of entertaining. "Charles, Lana, please come in." "Julia, you look wonderful," Charles said, and she could hear the relief in his voice. He'd been expecting tears, recriminations, desperate attempts to change his mind. Instead, he found his soon-to-be ex-wife looking exactly as she always had, poised, elegant, unflappable. Lana hung back slightly, her eyes taking in the oil paintings, the Persian rugs, the carefully curated collection of antiques that transformed the house into something approaching a private museum. Julia could see the calculations happening behind the younger woman's eyes, the mental cataloging of valuable objects and their potential resale value. "The house is even more beautiful than Charles described," Lana said, her voice carrying a hint of something that might have been envy. "You have such exquisite taste." "Thank you. Most of these pieces have been in my family for generations. They'll be coming with me, of course, when I relocate." Julia delivered the statement with perfect casualness, but she watched Charles's face tighten almost imperceptibly. He'd clearly been hoping she'd leave behind everything of value. They settled in the living room, where Marta had arranged the wine and appetizers on the antique coffee table that had once belonged to Julia's great-grandmother. Charles poured wine for all three of them, playing the role of gracious host in what was still technically Julia's home. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "So," Charles began, settling back in his usual armchair, "I thought we should discuss practical matters. The sooner we can finalize arrangements, the easier this will be for everyone." "Practical matters," Julia repeated, sipping her wine. Such as? Well, the house, obviously. It's probably too large for you to maintain alone, and frankly, the carrying costs are well within my means, Julia interrupted gently. Though I appreciate your concern, Lana leaned forward slightly. Charles mentioned you might want something smaller, more manageable. There are some lovely condominiums downtown with concierge services. The suggestion was so transparently self-serving that Julia almost smiled. Lana wanted the house, with its 6 bedrooms, chef's kitchen, and views of the bay. She wanted the established social position that came with the address, the automatic entry into country club society, the reflection of inherited wealth rather than earned success. I'm sure there are, Julia replied, but I've grown quite attached to this place. Charles and I built our life here. After all, she saw the flash of irritation cross Charles's face, the first crack in his composed facade. He'd expected her to be grateful for his suggestions, eager to simplify her circumstances, ready to quietly disappear into a smaller life. Julia, be reasonable, he said, his tone sharpening slightly. You can't possibly want to maintain all this. The grounds crew alone costs $1,500 a month. I've maintained detailed household budgets for 40 years, Charles. I'm quite aware of our expenses. The conversation continued for another hour, with Charles growing increasingly frustrated as Julia deflected each assumption about what she would or wouldn't want to keep. He'd clearly expected to walk away with the house, the wine collection, the art, and most of their shared assets, leaving Julia with a modest settlement and the burden of rebuilding her life from scratch. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who knew exactly what she owned, exactly what she was entitled to, and exactly how little she was inclined to make his transition convenient. As they prepared to leave, Lana excused herself to use the restroom. Charles immediately turned to Julia with barely concealed exasperation. What are you trying to accomplish here? He demanded. You're being deliberately difficult. I'm being thorough, Julia replied calmly. 40 years of marriage represents a significant accumulation of assets, Charles. It would be imprudent to make hasty decisions. This doesn't have to be adversarial. Julia, I'm trying to be fair. Fair? Julia set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. You announced your intention to divorce me on our anniversary so you could pursue a woman young enough to be your daughter. You've been secretly appraising my jewelry and attempting to liquidate community property. You bring your girlfriend into our home to discuss how quickly I can be relocated. And you consider this fair? Charles had the grace to look slightly ashamed. I know this is difficult, no, Charles. Difficult would imply we were facing this challenge together. What you've done is create a crisis and then demand that I solve it in whatever way is most convenient for you. Julia rose from her chair. I think it's time for you to leave. As Charles and Lana drove away, Julia felt a profound sense of relief. The performance was over. She'd played the role of dignified soon-to-be ex-wife for the last time. From this point forward, she would be playing a very different character, one Charles wouldn't recognize until it was far too late. Later that evening, as Julia prepared for bed, she opened her laptop and navigated to the Barrett Auctions website. Lot 47 gleamed on the screen in all its vintage glory, Provence blue paint catching the photographer's lights, wire wheels polished to mirror brightness, tan leather interior that looked soft enough to sleep on. Charles had described this particular E-Type as automotive perfection in a conversation with his car club friends last year. He'd researched its history obsessively, discovering that it had once been owned by a British racing driver in the 1960s before disappearing into private collections for decades. The ultimate gentleman's sports car, he'd called it. If I could own any car in the world, it would be that exact E-Type. Julia smiled as she bookmarked the auction page. Soon, it would be her E-Type, her gentleman's sports car, her symbol of liberation and perfect poetic justice. The ring would sell tomorrow. The trust would be established next week. And Charles's dream car would belong to the woman he dismissed as irrelevant. As she closed the laptop, Julia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw the photos from the club today. You and Charles look happy. Congratulations on 40 years. Margaret attached was a photograph someone had taken at the country club that afternoon. It showed Charles and Lana at a poolside table, her hand resting possessively on his arm, both of them laughing at something on his phone. The caption, clearly visible on Charles's social media profile, read, "Life begins at 60 with the right Person. Hashtag fresh start. Hashtag bless new chapter. Julia stared at the image for a long moment. Charles looked genuinely happy, more relaxed and animated than she'd seen him in years. Lana gazed at him with what might have been genuine affection, or might have been skillful performance, but what struck Julia most was the casual cruelty of the post. 40 years of marriage reduced to a hashtag about fresh starts. Decades of shared history dismissed as prologue to his real life. The announcement of her obsolescence broadcast to hundreds of acquaintances who would now regard her with that particular mixture of pity and curiosity reserved for discarded wives. Julia deleted the text without responding and turned off her phone. Tomorrow, Richard Whitmore would transfer $1.35 million into an account that Charles didn't know existed. Next week, Izzy would establish a trust that would allow Julia to bid anonymously on the Jaguar type that Charles considered the pinnacle of automotive achievement, and sometime soon, when the moment was perfect, when Charles was most confident in his new life, when he least expected it, Julia would reveal that his dream car belonged to the woman he'd described as irrelevant. The thought sustained her as she fell asleep in the king-size bed she'd shared with Charles for decades. Tomorrow, she would begin the final phase of her plan. Tomorrow, she would transform from discarded wife to anonymous bidder to the owner of Charles's deepest desire. Tomorrow, Charles Harrington would discover what happened when you underestimated Julia Westbrook. But tonight, she slept peacefully for the first time in months, dreaming of vintage sports cars and the sound of wind rushing past at 70 miles per hour, heading toward a horizon that belonged entirely to her. The Monterey Peninsula hummed with the refined energy of serious money in motion. From her suite at the lodge at Pebble Beach, Julia could see vintage automobiles being transported on custom trailers, their chrome gleaming in the California morning sun. Collectors from around the world had descended upon the coast for the most prestigious classic car auction week in North America, bringing with them hundreds of millions of dollars in potential purchases. Julia had arrived the evening before under the name Julia Westbrook, a detail that had required careful coordination with Izzy's legal team. The trust documents were flawless, establishing her as the sole beneficiary of the Westbrook Collection Trust, a fictional entity created specifically for this moment. To any outside observer, she was simply another wealthy widow looking to add to her late husband's automotive legacy. She stood at her suite's floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the controlled chaos of setup at the auction grounds below. Barrett Auctions International had transformed the historic Carmel Valley Ranch into a temporary cathedral of automotive worship, with pristine vintage cars arranged like jewels in a carefully curated display. Her phone buzzed with a text from Elliot Grant, the auction house director she'd been working with for the past month. Mrs. Westbrook, your bidding credentials are confirmed. Lot 47 preview begins at a.m. I'll be available if you need any additional details before bidding begins at 2 p.m. Julia had met Elliot twice during the preparation process, always in his San Francisco office, always maintaining the fiction that she was a new collector looking to honor her deceased husband's passion for British sports cars. At 63, Elliot possessed the perfect combination of discretion and expertise that high-end auction houses required. He'd worked with tech billionaires, Hollywood royalty, and European nobility, always maintaining absolute confidentiality about his clients' identities and motivations. Thank you, Julia typed back. I'll be there shortly. She dressed with deliberate Karen navy blazer over cream silk pants, pearls that had belonged to her mother, and Italian leather flats that whispered wealth without shouting it. The goal was to blend seamlessly with the crowd of serious collectors while projecting enough quiet authority to be taken seriously when bidding began. The preview area buzzed with testosterone-fueled conversations about horsepower, restoration, authenticity, and investment potential. Julia moved through the crowd like a ghost, observing but not engaging, listening to the whispered assessments of men who spoke about classic cars the way others discussed art or wine. She found Lot 47 in the prime position near the center of the preview tent. The 1961 Jaguar-type Roadster sat like a piece of sculpture, its Provence blue paint catching the filtered light in ways that seemed almost ethereal. The restoration was indeed flawless: chrome bumpers polished to mirror finish, wire wheels perfectly aligned, tan leather interior that looked supple enough to have been crafted yesterday. Julia circled the car slowly, noting details that Charles had described in obsessive detail during his years of pursuit. The matching numbers, engine, the original Dunlop racing tires, the period-correct radio that had been restored to working condition. Everything about the automobile represented the pinnacle of 1960 seconds British engineering, wrapped in a design that would still look modern 60 years later. Magnificent, isn't she? Julia turned to find a distinguished gentleman in his 70s studying the car with obvious appreciation. He wore the uniform of serious collectors, perfectly tailored sport coat, expensive but understated watch, the kind of casual confidence that came from owning things other people could only dream of. Indeed, Julia replied. The restoration appears exceptional. Marcus Blackwood, he said, extending his hand. I've been collecting E-types for 30 years, and I've never seen one this pristine. The provenance is extraordinary, as well owned by Sir Jackie Stewart's mechanic in the early 70s, then disappeared into a private collection in Switzerland for decades. Julia accepted his handshake with a smile. Julia Westbrook, I'm new to serious collecting, but my late husband always spoke of the E-type as the ultimate expression of automotive art. Your husband had excellent taste. Are you planning to bid today? I'm considering it, though I suspect the competition will be fierce. Blackwood chuckled. Oh, absolutely. There's a fellow from San Francisco who's been chasing this particular car for years. Charles something or other. Works himself into quite a state whenever it comes up for sale. I suspect he'll push the bidding well above the estimate. Julia felt her pulse quicken, but her expression remained perfectly composed. How interesting. I do hope the car finds an owner who will truly appreciate it, as do I. Though at these prices, most buyers end up treating them as investments rather than automobiles. Sad, really. These cars were meant to be driven. As Blackwood moved on to examine other lots, Julia lingered beside the Jaguar. She imagined Charles's reaction when he discovered her ownership, the shock, the outrage, the gradual realization that his carefully orchestrated divorce had handed her the perfect weapon for psychological warfare. But more than that, she found herself genuinely moved by the car's beauty. The E-type represented something beyond mere transportation or even status symbol. It was a piece of history, a manifestation of an era when automotive design had reached its artistic peak. Owning it wouldn't just be revenge, it would be a connection to something larger than her failed marriage. At T12:30, Julia took her assigned seat in the auction pavilion. The atmosphere crackled with anticipation as serious bidders settled into their designated areas. She'd chosen a seat in the middle section, close enough to observe the auctioneer clearly but far enough from the front rows to avoid drawing attention. Elliot Grant had provided her with a comprehensive briefing on auction etiquette and bidding signals. As Mrs. Westbrook, she would bid using subtle hand gestures, a raised finger for incremental increases, a slight nod for acceptance of the current bid. If the bidding exceeded her predetermined limit of $1 million, she would signal by touching her pearl necklace, indicating withdrawal from the competition. Charles arrived at 1:45, making his entrance with theatrical precision. He wore what Julia recognized as his special occasion blazer, navy cashmere with brass buttons paired with gray flannel trousers and Italian leather loafers. The outfit projected old money confidence, carefully calculated to suggest that price was no object. He was accompanied by two men Julia didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of expensive casual clothing that Silicon Valley executives favored for weekend social events. Potential investors, perhaps, or simply friends there to witness Charles's moment of triumph. Julia watched as Charles examined lot 47 one final time, running his hand along the Jaguar's curves with the reverence of a pilgrim touching a sacred relic. His face showed the kind of naked desire that he'd once reserved for her, back when they were young and still believed in forever. The auction began promptly at 2 o'clock with smaller lots, a 1967 Porsche 911 seconds, a restored MGTD, various automobilia and memorabilia. Julia observed the rhythm of the proceedings, noting how professional bidders signaled their intentions, how the auctioneer managed the energy of the room, how serious money moved through subtle gestures and coded communications. At T:43, the auctioneer's assistant wheeled lot 47 onto the presentation platform. The Jaguar gleamed under the pavilion lights, its blue paint seeming to glow with inner fire. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, lot 47, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd sold hundreds of millions of dollars in collector automobiles. A 1961 Jaguar Type Series 1 Roadster in the highly desirable Provence blue, matching numbers throughout, comprehensive restoration by marque specialists, and exceptional provenance. We'll start the bidding at $400,000. 3. Hands went up immediately, including Charles's. Julia sat perfectly still, watching the early skirmishing as casual bidders tested the waters. The price climbed steadily for 50, 500, 550, 600,000. At T650, one of the initial bidders dropped out, leaving Charles and a telephone bidder represented by a Barrett auction specialist. Julia could see the tension in Charles's shoulders as he realized he faced serious competition. 700,000, 750, 800,000. At T850, the telephone bidder withdrew, leaving Charles alone on the platform of presumed victory. Julia could see him relax slightly, assuming the car was now his for the taking. The auctioneer looked around the pavilion. $850,000. Do I hear 900,000? Julia raised her hand with practiced casualness. 900,000. Thank you, madam. The auctioneer's eyes moved back to Charles. Sir? Charles turned in his seat, scanning the crowd to identify his new competition. His eyes passed over Julia without recognition. She was simply another anonymous bidder in a sea of potential opponents. 950,000, Charles said, his voice carrying a slight edge. Julia nodded calmly. 1 million. A ripple of excitement passed through the audience. $1 million bids transformed automobile auctions from mere sales events into theater, where egos and obsessions played out under public scrutiny. Charles's face had tightened with concentration. At $1 million, he was approaching the limits of what he'd planned to spend. But Julia could see the calculation in his eyes. This was his car, his moment, his vindication of years of pursuit. 1,050,000, he called out, his voice now carrying a note of desperation disguised as determination. Julia touched her pearl necklace, the predetermined signal for withdrawal. The auctioneer scanned the crowd one final time. $1,050,000. Going once, going twice. Then Julia raised her hand again. $1,100,000, the auctioneer announced, his voice betraying the first hint of excitement. Charles turned again, more frantically this time, trying to identify the bidder who was stealing his dream. Julia sat perfectly still, her expression giving away nothing. The bidding continued in $50,000 increments. 115, 120, 125. With each increase, Charles's composure cracked a little more. This was no longer about acquiring a car. It had become about winning a contest he couldn't afford to lose. At $1,200,000, Charles hesitated for the first time. Julia could see him calculating rapidly, weighing his desire against his financial reality. She knew from Izzy's investigation exactly how much liquid capital he had available, exactly how far he could push before compromising his carefully planned future with Lana. 1,200,000, the auctioneer repeated. Do I hear 1,250,000? Julia raised her hand with perfect composure. Charles's face went pale. At one point to $5 million, he was well beyond his predetermined limit. But the car sat there on the platform like a taunt, like a test of his commitment to the new life he'd built in his imagination. 1,300,000, he said, his voice barely audible. Julia had won. She knew it, even if Charles hadn't realized it yet. At $1.3 million, he'd exceeded not just his budget but his borrowing capacity. Any higher, and he'd be forced to liquidate investments or tap into retirement funds he couldn't afford to touch. 1,350,000, she said clearly. The pavilion fell silent except for the whisper of ocean breeze through the tent walls. Charles sat frozen, his hand halfway raised, his face a mask of anguish and fury. He'd been outbid by an anonymous opponent who seemed to have unlimited resources and unlimited patience. The auctioneer waited the prescribed 30 seconds. $1,350,000. Going once, going twice. Sold to bidder number 8 for 7. Applause rippled through the crowd as Julia remained perfectly still. Around her, collectors and spectators buzzed with excitement about the record-setting sale. The Jaguar Type had become the most expensive example of its kind ever sold at public auction. Charles stumbled from his seat, his face ashen, his carefully constructed confidence shattered. Julia watched him push through the crowd toward the exit, followed by his bewildered companions who clearly hadn't expected to witness such public humiliation. Elliot Grant appeared at Julia's elbow, a discreet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Congratulations, Mrs. Westbrook. A truly exceptional acquisition." "Thank you," Julia replied. "When can I take delivery?" "We can arrange transport anywhere in the world." "Where would you like the car delivered?" Julia smiled for the first time since the bidding began. "I'll be in touch with specific instructions." The timing needs to be perfect. As she left the auction pavilion, Julia felt a profound sense of completion. The Jaguar E-Type wasn't just Charles's lost dream, it was her declaration of independence, her proof that underestimating someone could be a catastrophic mistake. The car would sit in secure storage for now, waiting for the perfect moment of revelation. When that moment came, when Charles was most confident in his new life, most certain that Julia had accepted her diminished circumstances, she would drive his dream car into the light and show him exactly what it costs to betray someone who'd spent 40 years learning how to win without fighting. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Julia returned from Monterey to find their house transformed into a stage set for Charles's accelerated timeline. His urgency had become palpable in the 3 days since the auction, phone calls at odd hours, hurried meetings with lawyers, and a barely concealed panic that manifested as aggressive efficiency. He wanted the divorce finalized before the end of the month, a timeline that now made perfect sense given his catastrophic overbid on a car that no longer belonged to him. Marta met Julia at the front door with the controlled expression she wore when delivering particularly sensitive intelligence. "He's been busy," she said quietly, helping Julia with her overnight bag. "The art appraiser came yesterday morning. Mr. Chen from the estate planning office was here for 2 hours, and Miss Mendez has been going through the house with measuring tape." Julia felt her jaw tighten. Measuring tape. She seemed very interested in the dining room dimensions and the master bedroom suite. Marta's tone carried 40 years of protective indignation. "She also asked me about the staff schedule and whether we'd be staying on after the transition." The presumption was breathtaking, even by Lana's standards. The young woman was already planning the layout of furniture she didn't own in a house that wasn't hers, while Charles liquidated assets to fund a lifestyle he could no longer afford. "Where is Charles now?" Julia asked. "Country club. He said he'd be back by 6 for dinner." Marta paused. "He seemed agitated, more than usual." Julia could imagine Charles's state of mind. He'd spent the weekend at Monterey expecting to return home with his dream car, only to be humiliated in front of the collector car community he'd spent years trying to impress. The defeat would have been devastating enough, but the financial implications were catastrophic. At $1.3 million, Charles had bid nearly every liquid asset he possessed, assuming he'd win. Now he faced the possibility of having to liquidate investments, tap retirement accounts, or most horrifying of all, acknowledge to Lana that his wealth had limits. "Marta," Julia said, settling her purse on the entry hall table, "I need you to do something for me. Tonight, after Charles goes to bed, I want you to photograph every piece of art in the house. Everything. Use your phone and email the images to me immediately." "You think he's planning to move them?" "I think Charles is planning several things he hasn't discussed with me, and I want documentation of everything in its current location before any of it disappears." Julia spent the afternoon in her private sitting room, fielding calls from Izzy about the final trust paperwork and coordinating with Elliot Grant about delivery arrangements for the Jaguar. The car would remain in Barrett Auction's secure facility until Julia specified a delivery location and date. She wanted the timing to be perfect, the moment when Charles felt most confident in his new arrangements, most certain that Julia had accepted her diminished circumstances. At T5:30, she heard Charles's Porsche in the driveway. Through her sitting room window, she watched him climb out of the car with the careful movements of someone fighting exhaustion. The weekend had clearly taken a toll, his usual confident stride replaced by something closer to a shuffle, his shoulders carrying the weight of plans gone awry. Julia met him in the foyer with the same gracious smile she'd perfected over 4 decades of marriage. "Charles, you look tired. How was the drive back from Monterey?" "Long," he replied, loosening his tie. "The auction was disappointing." "Oh, I thought you were quite optimistic about that Jaguar." Charles's face darkened. "Someone else wanted it more, apparently." Bidding went completely insane, well over market value. Amateur collectors with more money than sense. Julia nodded sympathetically. How frustrating. I know how much that particular car meant to you. It's just money, Charles said with forced casualness. There will be other cars, but Julia could see the lie in his eyes. The E-Type hadn't been just another car, it had been the centerpiece of his carefully constructed fantasy, the symbol of his successful transition from married retirement to swinging bachelor lifestyle. Without it, his narrative of triumphant reinvention looked considerably less impressive. They ate dinner in the smaller dining room, where Marta had prepared Charles's favorite braised short ribs with his preferred Barolo. Julia noted that he drank more wine than usual, and faster, as if trying to blur the edges of his disappointment. I've been thinking about timing, Charles said as Marta cleared the main course. For the finalization, I mean. I'd like to move things along more quickly than we originally discussed. Any particular reason for the urgency? Charles's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Just practical considerations. The longer we drag this out, the more complicated it becomes. Emotionally speaking, Julia recognized the deflection. Charles needed liquidity immediately to cover his auction obligations, to maintain his lifestyle with Lana, to avoid admitting that his grand exit from marriage had left him financially compromised. He was hoping Julia would accept a quick settlement rather than demanding her full share of their accumulated assets. I understand the appeal of efficiency, Julia replied carefully, though I want to ensure we're both protected legally. Some of our investments are quite complex. Nothing that can't be simplified, Charles said quickly. My lawyer thinks we can have everything resolved within 2 weeks if we avoid unnecessary complications. Complications such as detailed appraisals of every individual asset, art, jewelry, collectibles. That sort of thing gets expensive and time-consuming. Charles reached for his wine glass. I thought we might agree on reasonable estimates and split things down the middle. Julia almost smiled. Charles wanted to divide their assets based on reasonable estimates because he knew the actual appraised values would reveal how much community property he'd been secretly liquidating. A 50-50 split based on lowball estimates would leave him with cash and investments while giving Julia a fraction of what she was legally entitled to. I suppose that depends on how reasonable the estimates are, she said. The conversation continued through dessert, with Charles growing increasingly agitated as Julia declined to commit to his accelerated timeline. He'd clearly expected her to be grateful for his efficiency, eager to close the door on their marriage and disappear into quiet retirement. After dinner, Charles retreated to his study to make phone calls while Julia helped Marta with the dishes, a ritual that had always annoyed Charles, but which Julia treasured as one of the few moments of genuine domesticity in their increasingly performative home life. He's scared, Marta observed as she dried the wine glasses. I've never seen him like this. Usually when he's planning something, he gets excited. This feels different. He overextended himself at that auction, Julia replied. Now he's trying to liquidate assets quickly to cover the shortfall. Will you let him? Julia considered the question as she loaded the last of the plates into the dishwasher. 6 months ago, she might have. 6 months ago, she still believed in the fiction of their partnership, still assumed that Charles's financial decisions were made with her welfare in mind. No, she said finally. I won't make it easy for him. That night, Julia waited in her sitting room until she heard Charles's study door close and his footsteps on the stairs. 20 minutes later, Marta appeared with her phone, systematically photographing every painting, sculpture, and decorative object in the main rooms. The documentation process took 2 hours. Julia's grandmother's Waterford crystal collection. The Chickily glass sculpture Charles had bought for their 20th anniversary. The collection of California landscape paintings they'd acquired during the early years of his finance career. The Persian rugs that had belonged to Julia's parents. The antique furniture that had been in her family for generations. Each photograph was date-stamped and GPS-coded, creating an irrefutable record of what existed in the house on this particular night. If any pieces disappeared in the coming weeks, sold to private collectors or moved to storage facilities Julia didn't know about, she would have proof of the theft. At midnight, Marta finished uploading the final images to Julia's secure email account. Everything's documented, she whispered. If he tries to move anything, we'll know. Thank you, Julia replied. You're taking a risk helping me like this. No risk, Marta said firmly. This house has been my home for 25 years because you made it one. Mr. Charles, he sees me as staff. You've always seen me as family. After Marta retired to her quarters, Julia remained in her sitting room, scrolling through the photographs on her laptop. Each image represented not just monetary value but decades of shared history, the art they'd chosen together, the furniture they'd selected for their first apartment, the heirlooms that connected her to previous generations of her family. Charles thought he could divide these possessions based on convenience and his immediate financial needs. He assumed Julia would accept whatever he offered rather than fight for what she'd helped build. The miscalculation was so profound it was almost tragic. Julia's phone buzzed with a text from Elliot Grant. Mrs. Westbrook, I have an interesting update regarding the gentleman who was bidding against you at Monterey. My contacts indicate he may be experiencing some financial difficulties related to the auction. Should we be concerned about any complications with your purchase? Julia smiled as she typed her reply. No concerns on my end. My financial obligations are completely secure. Thank you for the information. Elliot's discretion was absolute, but his sources were impeccable. If he'd heard rumors about Charles's financial troubles, it meant the collector car community was already buzzing about the mysterious bidder who'd overextended himself at Barrett auctions. The irony was perfect. Charles had spent years building his reputation in the vintage car world, cultivating relationships with dealers and collectors, establishing himself as a serious player with unlimited resources. Now that carefully constructed image was cracking, and the same community that had once respected his judgment was gossiping about his spectacular failure. Julia closed her laptop and prepared for bed, feeling more at peace than she had in months. The Jaguar E-Type sat in secure storage, waiting for the perfect moment of revelation. The house and its contents were documented and legally protected. Charles's financial desperation was pushing him toward increasingly reckless decisions that would only strengthen her position. Tomorrow, she would call Anthony Vega to schedule a private viewing of her new car. She wanted to understand exactly what she'd purchased, to appreciate the mechanical poetry that had driven Charles to financial ruin. The Jaguar wasn't just a symbol of her victory, it was a work of art, a piece of history, a tangible representation of her liberation from a marriage that had become a performance. As she turned off the lights in her sitting room, Julia caught a glimpse of herself in the antique mirror that had belonged to her great-grandmother. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the shocked wife who'd received divorce papers on her anniversary. This woman looked calculating, confident, and completely in control of her destiny. Charles had unleashed something he couldn't predict or contain when he'd decided to betray 40 years of partnership. He'd assumed Julia would quietly accept whatever terms he offered, grateful for the stability of a clean divorce. Instead, he'd awakened someone who understood that the best revenge wasn't destruction, it was precision. And Julia Harrington had spent 4 decades learning how to be very, very precise. The morning of the charity garden party dawned with crystalline clarity, the kind of day Northern California delivered when it wanted to remind residents why they paid premium prices for paradise. Julia stood at her bedroom window, watching the catering staff arrange white linen tables across the manicured lawn that overlooked the lake. This was the same view she and Charles had admired 35 years ago during their first tour of the property, when they believed their future stretched endlessly before them like the shimmering water. The florists arrive at 11, and wine delivery is confirmed for noon, Marta announced from the doorway, carrying Julia's pressed ivory silk dress. At 72, their longtime housekeeper moved with the efficiency of someone who had orchestrated countless social events for the Harrington household. Perfect timing. Julia accepted the dress with steady hands. Has Charles called? This morning. Asked about the party. I told him what you instructed, charity event for the Arts Council. Nothing more. Good. He'll show up anyway. Men like Charles can't resist an audience, especially when they think they're missing something important. Julia moved to her vanity and began the careful ritual of preparing her armor for the day. Foundation applied with precision, mascara emphasizing her still striking green eyes, lipstick in confidential red, the shade she'd worn to every significant negotiation of her design career. She studied her reflection with the objective eye of someone who understood that presentation was often the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. The guest list read like Northern California society's who's who: judges, tech executives, philanthropists, and cultural patrons who had known the Harringtons throughout their marriage. More importantly, it included automotive journalists and vintage car enthusiasts who would appreciate the significance of what was to come. A T to 30, Julia made her final inspection. White roses from her prized garden created elegant centerpieces, their fragrance mixing with lavender that bordered the stone pathways. A string quartet played Mozart near the fountain, while servers prepared champagne and locally sourced hors d'oeuvres. Everything spoke of understated elegance. Julia's signature style. "You look absolutely radiant," came Eleanor Montgomery's familiar voice. The retired judge approached in navy blue with pearls that had probably belonged to her grandmother, her presence lending additional gravitas to any gathering. "Eleanor, thank you for coming, my dear. I wouldn't miss this for the world." Eleanor's eyes twinkled with something suggesting she knew more about the day's agenda than her words implied. "I understand there might be some interesting developments this afternoon." The first wave of guests began arriving at 3. Julia moved into hostess mode with practiced grace, greeting each arrival with genuine warmth while keeping one eye on the circular driveway. Conversations flowed easily: upcoming gallery openings, the symphony season, local politics, and the eternal Northern California topics of real estate and wine. "Julia, you look luminous," gushed Patricia Whitmore, wife of a tech mogul who had recently discovered philanthropy as a tax strategy. "I was so sorry to hear about your separation from Charles. You're handling it with such dignity." "Thank you, Patricia. I've found that life presents unexpected opportunities for growth. Sometimes what seems like an ending is actually a beginning in disguise." By 3:15, nearly 60 guests had arrived, settling into the comfortable rhythm of successful social events. Julia was discussing the Arts Council's upcoming exhibition with museum director Marcus Chen when Charles's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. Her pulse quickened slightly, but her expression remained serene as she continued her conversation. About contemporary installation art, Charles emerged from his car, adjusting his tie and surveying the gathering with calculating eyes. He wore the navy blazer Julia remembered selecting at Brooks Brothers 3 years ago, paired with khaki slacks and boat shoes, his distinguished gentleman of leisure uniform. "Julia, darling, what a magnificent gathering," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek as if their last conversation hadn't ended with his announcement about leaving her for someone young enough to be their daughter. "You've outdone yourself, Charles," she replied with cool politeness reserved for acquaintances. "How thoughtful of you to stop by. I trust Lana is well?" His smile faltered almost imperceptibly. "She's wonderful, thank you. Had prior commitments today, unfortunately. You know how busy young people stay." Julia nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, though they both knew Lana's absence probably related to the social awkwardness of attending a party hosted by the woman she'd helped displace. "Please do enjoy yourself. There are several people here you'd find interesting." As Charles worked the room with practiced ease, Julia watched him laugh with Judge Morrison, compliment Helen Ashford on her recent art acquisition, and discuss market trends with financial advisors. To anyone observing, he appeared to be a successful retiree enjoying a pleasant afternoon among friends. A T for o'clock precisely, Julia excused herself and walked to the fountain where acoustics would carry her voice clearly. She raised her hand slightly, and the string quartet smoothly concluded their piece, creating natural silence. "Friends, if I could have your attention," Julia called out, her voice carrying practiced authority. Conversations gradually quieted as guests turned toward her, champagne glasses pausing halfway to lips. "First, let me thank all of you for being here and for your generous support of the Marin County Arts Council." Polite applause rippled through the gathering. Julia waited for it to subside, her gaze briefly finding Charles near the rose garden. With a puzzled expression, "Many of you know this has been a year of significant transitions for me personally," she continued, voice steady and clear. "As I've navigated these changes, I've been reminded how important it is to pursue things that bring us joy, rather than simply accepting what others believe we should want or deserve." Eleanor Montgomery raised her champagne glass in subtle salute while other guests nodded approvingly. The words could be interpreted as philosophical observation, but those understanding the context of her divorce would recognize deeper meaning, which brings me to a special announcement. Today marks not just celebration of artistic achievement, but also a personal milestone I'd like to share with friends who have supported me throughout the years. At that exact moment, as if choreographed by destiny itself, the distant sound of a finely tuned engine began echoing up the driveway. Julia had timed this to perfection, coordinating with the delivery team for precisely for 15. The low, throaty purr of the vintage Jaguar type grew steadily louder, causing guests to turn toward the sound with automatic attention that rare automobiles commanded from those who appreciated mechanical artistry. Charles's expression shifted from mild curiosity to focused attention as the engine note registered. Julia watched his face carefully, seeing the exact moment recognition dawned. His champagne glass tilted dangerously in suddenly unsteady hands, and his carefully maintained composure cracked like ice under pressure. The 1961 Jaguar type coupe came into view slowly, driven by Anthony Vega with careful precision. The car's deep British racing green paint gleamed in afternoon sunlight, elegant lines flowing like liquid metal from the long hood to the distinctive fastback rear. Chrome wire wheels caught and reflected light with each revolution, while iconic covered headlights gave the vehicle predatory elegance. "Oh my goodness, is that a Series 1 type?" breathed automotive journalist Robert Fletcher, setting down his champagne and moving closer. "The proportions are absolutely perfect. That's extraordinarily rare." Several guests followed Fletcher's lead, drawn by automotive excellence's magnetic appeal. The car commanded exactly the attention Julia had anticipated from people who understood its significance. Anthony parked the Jaguar where it would be visible from the garden, then emerged with a slight smile suggesting he thoroughly enjoyed his role in the afternoon's theater. He wore dark slacks and a white button-down that complemented the car's elegant formality. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julia announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent garden, "I'd like you to meet my newest acquisition, a 1961 Jaguar type coupe, purchased at last weekend's Monterey auction." The reaction was immediate and varied. Car enthusiasts moved closer with reverence and envy, while other guests murmured appreciatively about Julia's unexpected entry into collector car markets. Several applauded, recognizing both the vehicle's rarity and the purchase's boldness. Julia's attention remained focused on Charles, whose face had drained of color as full implications became clear. She watched him process the information, the specific model, the Monterey auction mention, timing coinciding with his own failed bid. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed as mathematical certainty overwhelmed his ability to form words. "The car has quite a pedigree," Julia continued conversationally, as if discussing recent wine purchases rather than delivering psychological precision strikes. "Originally owned by a British racing driver, then carefully maintained by a Swiss collector for 30 years, completely restored to original specifications, with documentation proving authenticity and racing history." "Julia, that's absolutely magnificent," called Helen Ashford, moving closer to admire the lines. "I had no idea you were interested in vintage automobiles. What inspired this purchase?" Julia's smile was radiant. "Sometimes life presents opportunities to pursue dreams we didn't even know we had. When I learned about this particular car's availability, something spoke to me. Perhaps it was owning something so beautifully engineered, so perfectly designed for the simple joy of driving." The words were carefully chosen. Charles would recognize them as nearly verbatim repetition of his own descriptions from countless conversations over years. She had listened to him rhapsodize about the car's perfect proportions, revolutionary design, its representation of automotive artistry at its finest. Now those same words described her ownership of the vehicle he had coveted above all others. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. "Julia, might I have a word privately?" "Of course," she replied with gracious formality. "Though perhaps after our friends have appreciated the car properly, Anthony has kindly agreed to answer technical questions," as guests gravitated toward Anthony for restoration details. Julia circulated among others, accepting congratulations and fielding curious inquiries about her sudden entry into collector car markets. For the first time in months, she was being celebrated for her own choices rather than pitied for Charles's betrayal. At 5 o'clock, as the party reached natural conclusion and guests began departure noises, Charles finally cornered Julia near the rose garden. His earlier composure had evaporated entirely, replaced by confusion, anger, and something that might have been respect. "That's the car," he said without preamble, voice barely above a whisper. "The Jaguar from Monterey. The one I was bidding on." "Yes," Julia replied simply. "You bought it?" The question carried disbelief, as if the concept was literally incomprehensible. "I did. How? The winning bid was over $1 million. Julia regarded him with patient expression she might use with a slow child. Charles, we've been married 40 years. Did you really think I was unaware of my own asset's value? My engagement ring alone was worth considerably more than you apparently realized. Color drained from his face. You sold your ring? Your grandmother's ring? My ring, Julia corrected gently. Given to me, owned by me, disposed of as I saw fit. Unlike some people, I don't make financial decisions with other people's property. The barb hit its mark. Charles flinched as if physically struck, processing layered meanings. Not only had she outmaneuvered him for his dream car, but she'd done it using resources he'd failed to recognize or respect. But you loved that ring, he said weakly. I loved what it represented, Julia replied, with perfect calm. When that representation proved false, the ring became simply a valuable asset. I chose to convert it into something bringing genuine pleasure, rather than painful memories. As guests made final farewells, Julia found herself beside the Jaguar with Anthony, who carefully wiped fingerprints from chrome with a soft cloth. Afternoon sun slanted lower, casting golden light across the cars. Perfect curves. How did it feel? Anthony asked quietly. Julia considered seriously. Satisfying. Not vengefully, but the way completing a difficult puzzle feels satisfying. Everything fell into place exactly as it should have. And Charles? Charles is learning there's a difference between being powerful and being right. He assumed wanting something entitled him to have it, that other people existed to facilitate his desires. Today was simply gentle correction to that misunderstanding. As the last guest departed and catering staff began efficient cleanup, Julia remained beside her acquisition, watching sunset over the lake. The Jaguar seemed to glow in golden light, deep green paint shifting between emerald and forest hues as shadows played across its surface. The car represented more than revenge or victory, it symbolized reclamation of agency in her own life. For too many years, she had defined herself in relation to Charles's needs, supporting his ambitions while neglecting her own. The divorce forced her to confront that imbalance, and purchasing the Jaguar was her first truly independent decision in decades. As first stars appeared in darkening sky, Julia walked toward the house, leaving the Jaguar where it would catch morning light perfectly. Tomorrow she would take it for its first real drive, feeling engine power and handling precision. Tonight, it was enough knowing it was hers, purchased with her resources, owned on her terms, representing a future she would define entirely for herself. The garden party had been complete success, both as charitable fundraiser and declaration of independence. Charles arrived, expecting to find his discarded wife seeking sympathy. Instead, he discovered a woman who had transformed betrayal into opportunity for personal triumph. The Jaguar would be there in the morning, beautiful and powerful and entirely hers. And Julia Harrington, soon to reclaim her maiden name, would be ready for whatever adventures lay ahead on the road. She was finally free to choose. The morning after the garden party arrived gray and overcast, as if the weather itself sensed the storm brewing beneath the surface of Julia's carefully orchestrated world. She sat in her kitchen, savoring coffee from her favorite porcelain cup while reading the Peninsula Lifestyle magazine's early online coverage of yesterday's event. The photographs were everything she had hoped: elegant shots of the gathering, admiring close-ups of the Jaguar, and several images of herself looking poised and radiant beside her acquisition. Local philanthropist Julia Harrington surprised guests with her stunning new collector car. She read aloud to Marta, who was arranging fresh flowers from the garden. The 1961 Jaguar E-Type, purchased at last weekend's prestigious Monterey auction, represents a bold new direction for the arts patron. Julia smiled, setting down the tablet. Perfect coverage. Marta glanced toward the front windows where the Jaguar sat gleaming in the driveway. Mr. Charles called the house at 6 this morning. I let it go to voicemail, and he wants to speak with you urgently. Something about clarifying misunderstandings and discussing reasonable solutions. Marta's tone suggested exactly what she thought of Charles's sudden desire for reasonable discussion. Julia's phone rang. As if summoned by their conversation, Charles's name appeared on the screen, and she considered letting it join his morning voicemail before deciding that prolonging his agony served no useful purpose. Good morning, Charles. Julia, we need to talk now. His voice carried an edge of desperation she had never heard before. Can I come over? Of course. I'll be here. 30 minutes later, Charles's Mercedes pulled into the driveway with unnecessary speed, tires crunching on gravel as he parked haphazardly beside the Jaguar. Through the window, Julia watched him sit motionless in his car for several moments, staring at her acquisition with an expression that mixed longing and disbelief in equal measure. When he finally emerged, gone was the polished confidence that had defined their interactions since he announced the divorce. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strained, shirt wrinkled, hair uncombed, the kind of dishevelment that suggested a sleepless night spent wrestling with uncomfortable realities. "Julia," he began without preamble as she opened the front door. "Yesterday was quite a performance, but I think we both know this situation has gotten out of hand." "Has it?" She stepped aside to let him enter, noting how his eyes immediately tracked to the Jaguar's keys sitting casually on the entry table. "I thought it was rather successful. The Arts Council raised over $50,000, and everyone seemed to enjoy themselves." Charles followed her into the living room where morning light streamed through the French doors, illuminating the space she had decorated with such care over the years. He moved restlessly, unable to settle into any of the carefully chosen chairs that had once made him feel comfortable and powerful in his own home. "Don't play games with me, Julia. You know exactly what I'm talking about." He turned to face her, and she saw something she had never witnessed before: genuine fear flickering behind his usual bluster. "The car." "My car?" "Your car?" Julia's voice carried the kind of mild confusion she might use when correcting a simple factual error. "I'm afraid I don't understand. The registration clearly shows my name as the owner. You know what I mean. That specific E-type, I've been tracking it for 3 years. I had arrangements with the seller, contacts at the auction house. It was supposed to be mine." Julia settled into her favorite armchair, the one position to catch the best morning light, and regarded Charles with the patient attention she might give to an entertaining but ultimately pointless story. "Arrangements aren't ownership, Charles. As someone who spent 40 years in finance, surely you understand the difference between intention and possession." The casual cruelty of her response seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He sank into the chair across from her, elbows on knees, head in hands, a posture of defeat that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. "How much do you know?" he asked quietly. "About what specifically?" "Don't." His head snapped up, eyes meeting hers with desperate intensity. "Don't pretend you stumbled into buying that exact car by coincidence. Don't act like selling your grandmother's ring was some spontaneous decision. You've been investigating me." Julia considered her response carefully. She could continue the pretense of innocent surprise, but Charles was finally showing her the respect of treating her as an equal adversary, rather than a discarded wife. That deserved acknowledgement. "I know about the asset transfers," she said simply. "The art appraisals, the jewelry evaluations, your attempts to liquidate marital property before finalizing our divorce." Charles's face went ashen. "Is he among others? Did you really think you could secretly appraise my grandmother's art collection without someone noticing? Those pieces have been in my family for generations. I know their provenance better than any auction house." "I wasn't stealing from you," Charles said weakly. "I was just exploring options, trying to understand our full financial picture." Julia's laugh was soft but utterly without warmth. "Charles, you hired 3 different appraisers over the past 6 months. You had my jewelry photographed and cataloged by Sotheby's. You met with estate liquidation specialists twice in April alone. That's not exploring options, that's systematic preparation for asset stripping." The precision of her knowledge seemed to drain the last of his fight. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to take appropriate precautions. The car was supposed to fund the new life," Charles said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lana has expensive tastes, and my retirement accounts aren't as robust as I led her to believe. I thought if I could acquire the Jaguar at auction, hold it for a few years, the appreciation would cover other expenses." Other expenses, meaning the young girlfriend who expects to be maintained in the style she imagines she deserves. Charles flinched, but didn't deny it. "Something like that. And now I'm fucked?" The vulgarity sounded strange coming from a man who had always prided himself on refined speech. "Do you have any idea what that car means to me? What it represents?" "I have some idea, yes. You've only spent the better part of 3 years boring everyone at the country club with detailed descriptions of its significance. Julia's voice carried no sympathy. The question is whether you understand what it represents now. Before Charles could respond, the doorbell rang. Through the window, Julia could see Izzy's distinctive red BMW in the driveway, right on schedule for their 10 o'clock appointment. She had asked her goddaughter to arrive at this specific time, knowing that Charles's confrontation would need professional legal boundaries. That would be my attorney, Julia said, rising gracefully. I believe you know Izzy. Charles's expression shifted from despair to panic. Julia, wait, we don't need lawyers. We can work this out between us, like reasonable people. Can we? Because from where I sit, you spent months planning to defraud me of assets, then announced you were leaving me for someone barely older than our theoretical grandchildren, all while expecting me to quietly accept whatever terms you decided were fair. Julia paused at the living room entrance. That doesn't strike me as particularly reasonable behavior. Izzy entered with the confident stride of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a smile that managed to be both professional and predatory. At 35, she had inherited her mother's sharp intelligence and added her own steel to create one of the Bay Area's most formidable family law attorneys, Uncle Charles, she said pleasantly, using the honorary title she had employed since childhood despite the complete absence of warmth in her tone. How lovely to see you. I trust you enjoyed yesterday's garden party. Izzy, I'm glad you're here. Maybe you can help Julia understand that this situation doesn't require legal escalation. Oh, but it does. Izzy settled into the chair Julia indicated, opening her briefcase with practiced efficiency. You see, Charles, attempting to liquidate marital assets without spousal consent is actually quite serious. In California, it's considered financial elder abuse when one spouse systematically attempts to defraud another of their rightful property. The color drained from Charles's face entirely. Elder abuse? Julia's not elderly, and I wasn't abusing anyone. The law disagrees. At 65, Julia qualifies for enhanced protections under California's elder abuse statutes. Your pattern of behavior, secret appraisals, unauthorized liquidation attempts, concealing assets while planning divorce creates a compelling case for financial abuse. Julia watched Charles process this information, seeing the exact moment he realized the true scope of his predicament. She had not simply outmaneuvered him for a car, she had systematically documented his attempts at fraud and positioned herself with overwhelming legal advantage. What do you want? Charles asked finally, the question directed at Julia with the defeated tone of someone who finally understood he held no cards in this particular game. I want you to sign the revised divorce agreement. Izzy prepared. Julia replied simply. Clean division of assets as they actually exist, not as you hope to manipulate them. You keep your retirement accounts and personal property. I keep everything else. Everything else meaning the house, the art collection, the jewelry, the investment properties, and naturally, the Jaguar. Julia's smile was radiant with false sweetness. Consider it compensation for emotional distress and attempted financial fraud. Charles looked desperately between the two women, searching for some avenue of negotiation or escape. That leaves me with almost nothing. How am I supposed to start over? Julia suggested helpfully. Build a new life? Support an expensive young girlfriend? I suppose you'll need to be creative. Perhaps Lana will discover she has a taste for more modest accommodations. As if summoned by mention of her name, Charles's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and his expression grew even more stricken. Problems? Izzy inquired with professional interest. Lana wants to know when we can start looking at condos in Marin. She's found several she likes, all in the $2 million range. Charles set his phone face down on the coffee table as if it had personally betrayed him. Awkward timing, Julia observed. Perhaps you should explain to her that your circumstances have recently changed. The three sat in silence for several moments, the morning light gradually brightening as the coastal fog began its retreat. Julia found herself studying Charles's face, looking for traces of the man she had married for decades ago and finding only a stranger who had gambled away everything meaningful for the promise of renewed youth. If I sign this agreement, Charles said finally, what happens to us? To our history together? Our history is what it is. Julia replied. 40 years of marriage, including apparently the last several months of systematic deception. Signing the agreement simply acknowledges reality instead of perpetuating illusion. Charles reached for the pen as he offered, then hesitated. And if I refuse? Then we proceed to court, where discovery will reveal every detail of your attempted fraud, and you'll face both criminal charges and civil liability. You'll also lose access to marital assets immediately while the case is pending, which could take years. And Lana? Julia's smile was genuinely sympathetic for the first time all morning. Charles, Lana is 27 years old. She'll be fine. Young people are remarkably resilient when it comes to finding new opportunities. With shaking hands, Charles signed the divorce agreement, each signature sealing his fate with permanent finality. When the last document was complete, Izzy efficiently gathered the papers and tucked them back into her briefcase. Congratulations, she said brightly to Julia. You're now officially a free woman with excellent taste in vintage automobiles. After Charles left driving slowly past the Jaguar one final time with an expression of profound loss, Julia and Izzy sat on the terrace overlooking the lake, sharing coffee and watching boats navigate the morning waters. How does it feel? Izzy asked. Julia considered the question seriously. Surprisingly peaceful. I expected to feel triumphant or vindicated, but mostly I just feel free. Like I've finally stopped carrying weight I didn't realize I was bearing. And the car? Julia's gaze drifted to the driveway where the Jaguar gleamed in strengthening sunlight. The car is perfect. Not because it hurt Charles, but because it's something I chose entirely for myself. When was the last time I could say that about anything important? Her phone buzzed with a text from Anthony Vega. Saw the coverage in Peninsula Lifestyle. Congratulations on both the car and your courage. Would you like to take it for a proper drive this weekend? Julia smiled, typing her response. I'd love to. It's time to see what she can really do. The collapse was complete. Charles's carefully constructed plan had crumbled entirely, leaving him with exactly what he deserved, the consequences of his own choices. And Julia, for the first time in decades, was entirely free to write her own story on whatever roads she chose to travel. The morning of the Pebble Beach concourse. D'Elegance dawned with the kind of crystalline clarity that only Northern California could deliver. Azure skies stretched endlessly over Monterey Bay, and the Pacific breeze carried the salt-sweet promise of renewal. Julia stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her cream silk blouse, the fabric chosen deliberately to complement the Jaguar's pristine British racing green paint. She had learned, over 4 decades of marriage, that details mattered. Today, they would matter most of all. The doorbell chimed precisely at 8 o'clock. Through the frosted glass panels of her front door, she could see Anthony Vega's silhouette, tall, broad-shouldered, holding what appeared to be a small bouquet. Julia smiled, surprised by the flutter of nervous anticipation that coursed through her chest. When had she last felt this way? Not anxious exactly, but alive with possibility. Good morning, Julia, Anthony said as she opened the door, his warm brown eyes crinkling at the corners. He wore a charcoal sport coat over dark jeans, the perfect balance of refinement and approachability. I brought these for luck. He extended a small arrangement of white gardenias and eucalyptus, elegant, understated, nothing like the ostentatious orchid arrangements Charles had favored. They're perfect, Julia replied, accepting the flowers and inhaling their delicate fragrance. Would you like coffee before we go? The drive is only 40 minutes. But I find I think more clearly with caffeine. Anthony followed her into the kitchen, his gaze taking in the renovated space with its restored 1920 seconds cabinetry and modern conveniences seamlessly integrated. You have excellent taste, he observed. This kitchen manages to feel both timeless and contemporary. I designed it myself, Julia said, surprised by how easily the admission came. For years, she had downplayed her contributions to their home's aesthetics, allowing Charles to take credit for their sophisticated eye at dinner parties. Now, standing in the space she had meticulously planned and executed, she felt a surge of pride. Interior design was my first career before I married Charles. I sometimes wonder what might have happened if I'd continued. It's never too late to find out, Anthony said quietly, accepting the coffee she offered. His fingers brushed hers as he took the mug, and Julia felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the beverage. The drive to Monterey passed in comfortable conversation. Anthony navigated the coastal highway with the same steady confidence he brought to everything, while Julia found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years about her grandmother's Victorian mansion in Pacific Heights, her early jobs, staging homes for San Francisco's elite, the satisfaction of transforming spaces that had lost their soul. Anthony listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions that revealed his own appreciation for craftsmanship and restoration. "I think that's what drew me to vintage cars," he said, as they crested the hill overlooking Pebble Beach. "They represent a time when things were built to last, when beauty and function weren't mutually exclusive. There's something honest about restoring something to its original glory, don't you think?" Julia considered this as they descended toward the legendary 18th Fairway, where the world's most prestigious automotive concourse was already in full swing. Gleaming automobiles stretched across the manicured grass like jewels on emerald velvet. Ferrari 250 GTOs, Bugatti Type 57 Seconds, Mercedes-Benz 300 LS, each one representing not just mechanical perfection but the dreams and obsessions of their owners. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I understand exactly what you mean." The registration tent buzzed with activity as Julia presented her credentials. The volunteer, a silver-haired woman whose badge identified her as Margaret Williamson, looked up from her clipboard with surprise that quickly transformed into delight. "Mrs. Harrington, what an honor to have you participating this year. We were so thrilled to receive your entry. The 1961 E-Type Roadster Series 1, correct? Original numbers matching?" "Indeed," Julia replied, signing the forms with practiced elegance. "I'm looking forward to sharing it with everyone. The press has been asking about you all morning," Margaret continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Apparently, Town and Country is doing a feature on distinguished collectors, and your name came up repeatedly. There's a photographer from Vanity Fair here as well, something about powerful women and their automotive passions." Julia felt Anthony's reassuring presence beside her as she processed this information. She had anticipated attention, but this level of media interest was unexpected. "I see. Well, I suppose we'll handle that when it comes." Their assigned spot was in the exclusive classic British section, positioned between a pristine Aston Martin DB4 and a McLaren F1 that even Julia recognized as extraordinarily rare. As they approached, she saw the Jaguar gleaming in the morning sun, its curves as sensual and perfect as the day it had rolled off the Coventry assembly line 63 years ago. The custom license plate GH owned caught the light like a quiet declaration of independence. "She's magnificent," Anthony murmured, his professional eye taking in every detail. "The restoration work is flawless. Whoever handled this understood that originality is everything." "Actually," Julia said, surprising herself with the admission, "I did most of the research myself. I spent months studying period-correct details, tracking down original parts suppliers, even learning about the specific shade of green used in 1961. I wanted to understand every aspect of what I was acquiring." Anthony turned to look at her with something approaching awe. "You researched and restored this yourself?" "I supervised every detail," Julia clarified, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "I may have been out of practice, but I never lost my eye for authenticity." Before Anthony could respond, a familiar voice cut through the morning air like a discordant note in a symphony. "Well, I'll be damned. Julia, what the hell are you doing here?" Charles stood 20 feet away, his face flushed with what appeared to be equal parts surprise and fury. He wore his standard concours uniform navy blazer, white trousers, deck shoes without socks, but something was different. His usual confidence seemed forced, his smile strained at the edges. Behind him, Julia noticed, was a significantly younger woman she didn't recognize, not Lana, who had apparently moved on to more promising prospects. "Hello, Charles," Julia replied evenly, her voice carrying just enough warmth to sound civil and just enough coolness to establish distance. "I'm here with my car, naturally. I assume you're here in your usual capacity as an observer?" Charles's jaw tightened at the subtle emphasis on observer. For years, he had attended these events as a wannabe collector, someone who talked knowledgeably about automotive history but never quite managed to acquire the truly special pieces. The irony of Julia now standing beside the very car he had coveted was not lost on either of them. "Your car?" Charles's voice cracked slightly. "Julia, we need to discuss this privately." There's been some sort of misunderstanding, Mrs. Harrington. A polished woman in her 40s approached with a photographer in tow. I'm Sarah Chen from Town and Country. Would you have a moment for a few questions? We're doing a feature on women who are reshaping the collector car world, and your story has been absolutely fascinating to research. Julia felt Anthony's subtle nod of encouragement. Of course, she replied graciously. I'd be happy to speak with you. The interview unfolded like a masterclass in understated elegance. Sarah asked thoughtful questions about Julia's background, in design, her approach to collecting, and her plans for the Jaguar. Julia answered with the poise of someone who had spent decades hosting charity events and managing public appearances, but there was something different now, an authenticity that came from speaking her own truth rather than supporting someone else's narrative. What drew you to this particular car? Sarah inquired, her recorder capturing every word. The E-Type represents a perfect marriage of form and function, Julia explained, her hand resting gently on the Jaguar's polished bonnet. Jaguar's chief designer, Malcolm Sayer, was actually an aerodynamicist, and you can see that in every line. There's no ornamentation for its own sake, every curve serves both beauty and performance. I find that approach to design deeply appealing. From the corner of her eye, Julia could see Charles hovering nearby, his face growing more agitated. With each articulate response, the photographer captured several shots: Julia beside the car, Julia in conversation with Anthony, Julia examining the engine bay with the confident air of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. And your plans for the car? Sarah continued. Will you be showing it regularly? I intend to drive it, Julia said simply. Cars like this aren't meant to be garage queens. They're meant to be experienced, appreciated, lived with. I'm planning to take it on the California Mill this spring, a 1,000-mile tour through some of the most beautiful roads in the state. How wonderful, Sarah beamed. And I understand you have a background in interior design? Are you considering returning to that field? The question caught Julia off guard, but only for a moment. I've been giving it serious thought, actually. I have some ideas about sustainable historic preservation, combining traditional craftsmanship with modern environmental consciousness. There's a real opportunity to honor the past while building responsibly for the future. As the interview concluded and the photographer captured final shots, Julia noticed a small crowd had gathered. Other owners, judges, and spectators watched with interest as she discussed the Jaguar's technical specifications with surprising depth. Anthony stood nearby, beaming with obvious pride, while Charles lingered at the periphery like a storm cloud that had lost its power to threaten. Julia, Charles approached as the crowd dispersed, his new companion having wandered off to examine a nearby Porsche. We really do need to talk. This whole situation has gotten out of hand, has it? Julia asked mildly, adjusting her silk scarf. In the ocean breeze. I'm not sure what situation you're referring to, Charles. I'm simply enjoying a lovely day at the concourse with my car. Your car? Charles's voice rose slightly, drawing glances from nearby spectators. That's my car, Julia. You know damn well I've been trying to buy it for years. Whatever game you're playing, I'm not playing any game, Julia interrupted, her tone remaining perfectly level. I purchased this car at auction with my own money. I obtained by selling my engagement ring. You remember the ring, don't you? The one you gave me 40 years ago, when you promised to love and honor me. I thought it was fitting to transform that symbol of broken promises into something genuinely beautiful. Anthony stepped closer, not threateningly but with quiet support. Is everything all right here? Everything is perfect, Julia replied, her smile radiant. Anthony, I believe it's time for the judges to make their rounds. Shall we prepare the display materials? As they walked away, leaving Charles standing alone beside the car he would never own, Julia felt something she hadn't experienced in months: lightness. Not the hollow satisfaction of revenge, but the genuine joy of reclaiming her own narrative. The judging proceeded smoothly, with Julia fielding technical questions from the panel with impressive knowledge and grace. When asked about the restoration philosophy, she spoke eloquently about respecting original intent while ensuring mechanical reliability. The judges nodded approvingly, clearly impressed by her expertise. Later, as the afternoon sun began to slant across the Monterey Peninsula, Anthony suggested they walk down to the water's edge. The beach below the 18th fairway was nearly deserted. The concourse crowd focused on the afternoon awards ceremony. You were remarkable today, Anthony said as they stood watching the waves roll in. Watching you with those judges, with The press you commanded that space like it was always yours. Maybe it was, Julia replied thoughtfully. Maybe I just forgot for a while. They stood in comfortable silence, the sound of the ocean providing a peaceful counterpoint to the distant hum of the concourse. Julia felt Anthony's presence beside her, solid, reassuring, but never overwhelming. So different from Charles's need to dominate every space he entered. Julia, Anthony said quietly, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but would you consider having dinner with me tomorrow night? Somewhere without vintage cars or ex-husbands or photographers. Just us. Julia turned to face him, studying his weathered face, his kind eyes. The way he looked at her was something approaching wonder. I would like that very much, she replied. As they walked back up the hill toward the Jaguar, Julia spotted Sarah from Town and Country approaching with a final question. Mrs. Harrington, I'm sorry to bother you again, but I wanted to ask what's next for you. After everything you've been through, where do you see yourself going from here? Julia paused beside her car, her hand resting on the door handle. The Jaguar gleamed in the golden afternoon light, its British racing green paint reflecting the endless possibilities of the California sky. In the distance, she could see Charles deep in conversation with someone else, no longer looking in her direction. The realization struck her that she felt nothing at all when she looked at him, not anger, not sadness, not even satisfaction. Just the neutral acknowledgement of someone who had once been important but now belonged firmly in the past. I'm not looking backward anymore, Julia said finally, her voice clear and certain. I'm driving forward. As the sun began to set over Monterey Bay, painting the sky in shades of coral and gold, Julia Harrington climbed into her Jaguar E-Type and drove toward whatever came next, and for the first time in 40 years. That destination was entirely her own choice. The law offices of Morrison, Chen and Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of a gleaming tower in downtown San Francisco, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the Bay Area that never failed to remind visitors of the city's enduring power and beauty. Julia arrived at precisely 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in early November, her heels clicking with quiet authority against the marble floors as she made her way to the conference room where her future would be formally documented and sealed. Izzy waited for her in the reception area, impeccable as always in a charcoal Armani suit that spoke of success earned rather than inherited. Her goddaughter's face lit up with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal affection as Julia approached. Good morning, Godmother, Izzy said, using the childhood nickname that had evolved into a term of endearment between them. Ready to make this official? More than ready, Julia replied, adjusting the strap of her vintage Hermes bag, a gift to herself from the previous weekend's Anaquing expedition with Anthony. I've been ready for months. Today just happens to be when the paperwork catches up with reality. They walked together toward the conference room, past offices where other attorneys handled the complex negotiations of lives being entangled and restructured. Julia had once imagined that divorce would feel like failure, like an admission that 4 decades of her life had been wasted. Instead, she felt the strange lightness that comes from finally setting down a burden you didn't realize you'd been carrying. The conference room was elegant but understated, its mahogany table polished to a mirror sheen and surrounded by leather chairs that whispered of serious money and serious consequences. Charles was already seated at the far end, flanked by his attorney, a sharp-featured man named Patterson who had built a career on protecting wealthy men's assets during messy separations. Charles looked older than Julia remembered, his face drawn with the kind of stress that comes from watching carefully laid plans crumble into dust. Julia, Charles said as she entered, rising with the automatic courtesy that had been drilled into him at boarding school decades ago. You look well. Thank you, she replied politely, taking her seat across from him with the composed grace of someone who had attended countless board meetings and charity galas. Shall we begin? The next hour passed in a carefully choreographed dance of legal language and financial calculations. Patterson made several half-hearted attempts to challenge various aspects of the settlement, the valuation of Julia's inherited artwork, the division of their investment portfolio, the question of spousal support, but each objection was smoothly deflected by Izzy's meticulous preparation and Julia's own surprisingly detailed knowledge of their assets. Regarding the Presidio Heights property, Patterson said, consulting his notes. My client maintains that improvements made during the marriage should be considered joint assets. The property was inherited by Mrs. Harrington from her grandmother. Izzy replied without missing a beat. All improvements were documented as separate property investments, funded by Mrs. Harrington's individual accounts. We have receipts, contractor agreements, and bank records dating back 15 years. Julia watched Charles's face as Patterson's arguments were systematically dismantled. She had spent months with Izzy, patiently documenting every financial detail of their marriage, tracing the origins of assets and income streams with the thoroughness of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient civilization. What they had discovered was that Julia's contributions, both financial and otherwise, had been far more substantial than even she had realized. The house in Presidio Heights, the art collection she had carefully curated, the vintage jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, even a significant portion of their investment portfolio, all of it could be traced back to Julia's family money or her own professional earnings from the early years of their marriage. Charles, it turned out, had been living off her resources far more than either of them had acknowledged. And the matter of the engagement ring? Patterson asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer would not favor his client. The ring was Mrs. Harrington's separate property from the moment it was given to her, Izzy explained patiently. She was free to dispose of it as she saw fit. The fact that she chose to sell it and use the proceeds to purchase a vintage automobile is entirely within her rights. Charles's jaw tightened at the mention of the Jaguar, but he said nothing. Julia had heard through mutual acquaintances that he had attempted to buy the car from her through intermediaries, offering increasingly desperate sums that only highlighted how thoroughly he had misunderstood the situation. The car had never been about money for her, it had been about reclaiming something he thought he owned, something he believed she could never truly understand or appreciate. If there are no further objections, the mediator said, a gray-haired woman whose calm demeanor had shepherded countless couples through the formal dissolution of their lives together, we can proceed to the final signatures. Julia picked up her Mont Blanc pen, the one Charles had given her for their 20th anniversary, and paused for just a moment, not from hesitation, but from a desire to fully experience this moment of transformation. Across the table, Charles was already signing his name with sharp, angry strokes, as if the force of his signature could somehow alter the reality of what was happening. Her own signature flowed across the page with elegant confidence. Julia Catherine Westbrook. Not Harrington, but her maiden name, reclaimed after 4 decades of being someone else's wife. The sound of the pen against paper seemed to echo in the quiet room, marking not just the end of a marriage but the beginning of something entirely new. Congratulations, the mediator said, though her tone was appropriately solemn. The divorce is final as of this date. You're both free to begin the next chapters of your lives. Charles was the first to leave, gathering his papers with mechanical efficiency and exiting the conference room without a backward glance. Julia watched him go with something approaching sympathy, not for the man who had betrayed her, but for the hollow existence he had chosen for himself, living always in pursuit of the next acquisition, the next status symbol, the next young woman who might temporarily fill the emptiness where a soul should be. How do you feel? Izzy asked as they stood alone in the conference room, the morning sun streaming through the windows and casting long shadows across the polished table. Free, Julia replied, and realized as she said it that the word didn't quite capture the complexity of what she was experiencing. Not just free from Charles, but free to be myself again. Does that make sense? Perfect sense, Izzy assured her, gathering the legal documents that would need to be filed with the court. You've reclaimed yourself godmother. That's no small thing. They left the building together, stepping out into the crisp November air that carried the promise of winter, rains, and new beginnings. Julia had parked the Jaguar in a nearby garage, and as they walked toward it, she felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came with the prospect of driving, not to escape from something, but to move toward whatever came next. Lunch? Izzy suggested as they reached the car. We should celebrate properly. Actually, Julia said, surprising herself with the decision. I think I'd like to drive for a while, clear my head, process everything that just happened. Rain check? Izzy smiled with understanding. Of course. But call me later. I want to hear how you're doing. Julia settled into the Jaguar's leather seat, adjusting the mirrors and running her hands over the polished wood steering wheel. The engine came to life with a purr that spoke of precision engineering and meticulous maintenance. Anthony's influence, evident in every perfectly tuned note. She had learned to drive this car with the same careful attention she had once brought to interior design, understanding that mastery came not from force but from sensitivity to subtle feedback. She drove out of the city slowly, taking surface streets rather than the highway, wanting to savor the transition from her old life to her new one. As she crossed the Golden Gate Bridge, the Pacific stretched endlessly to the west, its gray-green surface reflecting the clouded sky like hammered pewter. The bridge's iconic towers rose around her, monuments to human ambition and engineering prowess, and she felt a kinship with the anonymous architects and builders who had dared to span this magnificent bay. Highway 1 beckoned northward, winding along the coast through small towns and redwood groves, past beaches where harbor seals basked on sun-warmed rocks and pelicans dove for fish in the churning surf. Julia drove without destination, letting the road guide her through Marin County and into Sonoma, where vineyards stretched across rolling hills and the air carried the sweet scent of fermenting grapes. She stopped for lunch in a small town called Occidental, parking the Jaguar outside a cafe that looked like it had been transplanted from a European village. The proprietor, a middle-aged woman with paint-stained fingers and knowing eyes, complimented her car and struck up a conversation about the local art scene. "You have excellent taste," the woman said, nodding toward the Jaguar. "Not many people understand the difference between owning something beautiful and appreciating its beauty." "I'm still learning that distinction myself," Julia admitted, accepting a cup of coffee that tasted of distant mountains and careful roasting. As she sat on the cafe's sun-drenched patio, watching local residents go about their unhurried daily routines, Julia's phone buzzed with a text message. She expected it to be Izzy, checking on her emotional state, or perhaps Anthony, with whom she had plans for dinner that evening. Instead, the message was from an unknown number. "Julia, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand everything I did was because I thought we were growing apart. I never meant to hurt you. If there's any chance we could talk, maybe work things out. Charles." Julia stared at the screen for a long moment, processing the words and the desperate undertone they couldn't quite conceal. 6 months ago, receiving this message would have shattered her heart all over again. 3 months ago, it might have filled her with vindictive satisfaction. Now, it simply felt like communication from a stranger, someone she had once known, but who no longer held any power to wound or heal her. She deleted the message without responding, then blocked the number. Not out of anger, but out of recognition that some conversations belonged to the past, and some bridges were meant to be crossed only once. The drive home took her through Alexander Valley, where the late afternoon sun slanted through oak trees and painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber. She thought about the dinner she would share with Anthony that evening, not at some exclusive restaurant designed to impress, but at his workshop, where he had promised to cook for her while showing her the 1967 Mustang he was restoring for a client in Seattle. There was something deeply appealing about Anthony's world: the honest work of restoration, the satisfaction of bringing mechanical beauty back to life, the community of craftspeople and enthusiasts who valued authenticity over ostentation. He had never once asked her about her financial situation or her connections in San Francisco society. Instead, he wanted to know about her thoughts on color theory, her opinions on sustainable design practices, her dreams for the future that had nothing to do with her past. As she navigated the winding roads back toward the coast, Julia found herself thinking about the letter that had arrived that morning, an inquiry from a boutique design firm in Sausalito that specialized in historic preservation. They had read about her in Town and Country and wanted to discuss a potential collaboration on a Victorian mansion restoration project. The timing felt like providence, an opportunity to reclaim the professional identity she had set aside for marriage. The sun was beginning to set as she reached the coastal highway, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples that reflected off the Jaguar's polished surface. She pulled into a scenic overlook and stepped out of the car, breathing in the salt air and listening to the eternal rhythm of waves against rock. Her phone buzzed again this time. It was Anthony. "How did everything go today? I've been thinking about you." Julia smiled as she typed her response. "Perfect. Free. Looking forward to dinner and whatever comes next." His reply came immediately. "Me too. Drive safe, beautiful." As she prepared to get back in the car for the final stretch home, Julia noticed A FedEx envelope tucked under the Jaguar's windshield wiper. Her address was written in Charles's familiar handwriting, but when she opened it, she found only a single sheet of paper, a bank statement showing that he had transferred her grandmother's jewelry from their joint safety deposit box to an account in her name alone. No note, no explanation, no plea for forgiveness, just a simple acknowledgement that some things had always belonged to her and always would. Julia folded the statement and slipped it into her purse, then climbed back into the Jaguar. The engine responded instantly, ready for whatever journey lay ahead. As she pulled back onto Highway 1, heading south toward home and dinner with a man who saw her as she truly was, Julia Westbrook realized that revenge had been the wrong word. For what she had accomplished, she hadn't gotten revenge on Charles. She had simply reclaimed herself. The road stretched ahead, winding through gathering dusk toward a future that belonged entirely to her. In the rearview mirror, the past grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared altogether around a curve. In the coastal hills, Julia pressed the accelerator and drove forward into whatever came next. The Jaguar's headlights cutting through the twilight like twin beacons pointing toward tomorrow. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.